This is Bible Stories for Sleep. For thousands of years, the stories of Scripture have been a place of refuge, a sanctuary for the weary mind. Tonight that sanctuary opens through the Nativity in Bethlehem. If you find rest here, a quick subscribe helps us keep these stories coming. Now set aside what you are carrying, trust that tomorrow is in good hands, and let your mind grow still. The limestone hills of Lower Galilee caught the slant of the late afternoon sun, turning the pale, sun-baked earth into shades of amber and rose. Across the terraced slopes of Nazareth, olive trees cast long, thin shadows over paths worn smooth by generations of sandals, hooves, and the passage of quiet lives. The air carried the sharp, clean scent of wild thyme crushed underfoot, mingling with the faint, sweet smoke of wood fires drifting from stone-built dwellings tucked into the hillside. It was a landscape that demanded endurance, shaped by hard stone and seasonal rains, yet it held a profound, timeless stillness for those who knew how to listen. In a modest stone courtyard overlooking the valley, Mary of Nazareth stood by a low wooden work table, her fingers tracing the smooth grain of an unfinished cedar beam. Her gaze drifted across the patchwork of green valleys and grey ridges stretching toward the distant blue haze of the Mediterranean. She was young, yet her eyes held the depth of a quiet ocean, reflecting a composure that seemed untouched by the restless murmurings of the village below. To the people of Nazareth, Mary was known for her steady grace and a watchful, contemplative spirit that often set her slightly apart. But beneath that outward calm, she carried a mystery so vast and luminous that it sometimes made her breath catch in the quiet hours of the night. She remembered the sudden, dazzling clarity of an encounter that had altered the course of her existence, words spoken in the stillness of her room, promising that the hope of ages would take flesh within her quiet life. Since then, the world around her had not changed, yet everything had shifted. The dust of the path, the blue of the evening sky, the rustle of the olive leaves, all of it felt charged with a quiet, holy expectancy. Yet, life in Nazareth moved forward with its ordinary, unyielding demands. Gossip had a way of clinging to the dusty corners of the village lanes, and Mary had felt the weight of averted eyes and whispered speculation. People saw a young woman facing an uncertain future, bound to a humble carpenter whose lineage traced back to the ancient royal house of David, yet whose daily reality was defined by calloused hands and the scent of sawdust. Mary bore these trials not with defiance, but with a serene, inward strength, trusting in the unseen architect of her destiny. From the shaded interior of the workshop, the rhythmic scrape of a hand plane against timber ceased. Joseph straightened his back, wiping a sheen of sweat from his forehead with the back of a scarred wrist. He looked out into the courtyard, his dark eyes softening as he watched Mary. He was a man of few words, built for endurance and quiet loyalty, with shoulders broadened by years of lifting heavy timber and wrestling with intractable stone and wood. Joseph's mind, however, was rarely at rest. He had known his own private tempests months ago when the reality of Mary's condition had first come to light. He remembered the long, sleepless nights spent pacing the dirt floor of his room, wrestling with the conflict between societal law and a deep, intuitive reverence for the woman he had pledged to protect. Then had come the shift, a midnight reassurance in a dream that had quieted the storm in his chest and anchored his soul to a higher purpose. Since that night, Joseph had viewed himself not merely as a betrothed husband, but as a guardian appointed by heaven itself. Yet, anxiety remained a persistent shadow, not for himself, but for her. He looked at Mary's delicate frame and felt the acute, crushing weight of his own limitations. He was a provincial craftsman, far removed from the centers of power in Jerusalem, let alone the grand halls of empires. How was he to shield her from the coming hardships? How could a simple carpenter provide a safe haven for a mystery that belonged to the heavens? As if sensing the unspoken turbulence in his thoughts, Mary turned from the cedar beam and met his gaze. She offered a gentle, reassuring smile, a silent anchor that cut through Joseph's lingering worries. Before Joseph could speak, the distant sound of heavy iron-shod hooves and the harsh bray of pack animals broke the quiet rhythm of the afternoon. Down on the main road winding through the valley, a cloud of white dust rose into the clear air, heralding the arrival of messengers from a world far removed from the pastoral tranquility of Galilee. Imperial decrees did not consult the convenience of peasants. They swept across the landscape like a dry wind, indifferent to the lives they disrupted. An official imperial courier, flanked by 2 Roman guards in leather cuirasses, rode into the public square of Nazareth. The heavy bronze medallion on the lead horse's harness glinted coldly in the fading light. A crowd of villagers quickly gathered, their faces tight with apprehension as the local magistrate stepped forward to unroll a stiff parchment bearing the seal of Quirinius, the governor of Syria. The proclamation was clear, uncompromising, and sweeping. Caesar Augustus had ordered a census of the entire inhabited world. Every man must return to his ancestral home to be registered, taxed, and catalogued by the sprawling machine of the empire. For the people of Nazareth, the news was received with sullen resignation. It meant abandoning fields just as the winter crops needed tending. It meant borrowing coin from merciless lenders to pay for the journey. It meant walking miles upon miles of stony tracks while carrying the meager provisions of the poor. Joseph listened to the reader's voice drone on, his jaw tightening as the implication settled over him. His ancestral home was not Nazareth, where he had built his life, his friendships, and his workshop. His roots ran deeper south, down through the rugged, limestone hills of Judea, to the ancient, crowded town of Bethlehem, the city of David. 80 miles. For a healthy man, it was a grueling 4 or 5 days of relentless walking over steep, treacherous terrain. For Mary, carrying the very fullness of time within her, the journey was an unthinkable trial. Joseph pushed his way through the murmuring crowd and returned to the courtyard, the parchment's decree echoing heavily in his mind. He found Mary standing where he had left her, her expression remarkably untroubled, though her eyes betrayed a quiet acknowledgement of the road ahead. "You heard," Joseph said, his voice deep and rough with a mixture of frustration and protective dread. He stepped closer, as if he could somehow physically shield her from the harsh mandate of Caesar. "Bethlehem. It is a long way, Mary. The road through the Samaritan hills is steep, and the mountain passes are bitter cold when the sun goes down. I do not see how." "We will go, Joseph," Mary interrupted softly, her voice carrying an absolute, unshakable clarity that instantly quieted his spiraling fears. She placed a hand gently on his forearm, feeling the steady, rapid pulse beneath his skin. The decrees of emperors reach far, but they do not outrun the purposes of heaven. If the road leads to Bethlehem, then that is where we are meant to be. Joseph looked down at her hand, and the tension in his shoulders slowly began to ease. There was a profound gravity in her words, an unwavering trust that seemed to draw the scattered pieces of his courage back together. He nodded slowly, the protective instinct hardening into a resolute, unyielding commitment. Whatever awaited them on the dusty roads of Judea, whatever cold nights or indifferent crowds lay ahead, he would walk every step beside her. He would be her shelter. The preparations were swift, for they had little to leave behind and less to pack. The next morning, before the pale dawn had burned the mist off the valley floor, the small household was ready. Joseph secured a sturdy, patient donkey with a thick woolen pack saddle, draping a woven blanket over its back to ease Mary's seat. He packed a small leather bag with dried figs, hard barley bread, a skin of fresh water, and his essential carpenter's tools, a silent reminder of his trade and his means of survival. As the first golden rays of the sun struck the stone rooftops of Nazareth, Mary mounted the donkey with quiet grace, her blue mantle pulled closely around her shoulders against the morning chill. Joseph adjusted the lead rope, casting one last lingering look at his workshop, before turning his face toward the southern horizon. They stepped out of the courtyard and onto the open road, joining a shifting stream of travelers, merchants, and fellow villagers who were all compelled by the same imperial command. At first, the road was familiar, winding past terraced olive groves and green pastures that they had known since childhood. But with every mile, the landscape began to change, shedding its gentle greenery for something harsher, wilder, and more ancient. As they left Lower Galilee behind and crossed the border into Samaria, the terrain grew rugged. The hills became steeper, carved by ancient watercourses and dotted with scrub oak and sharp limestone crags. The path narrowed, hugging the edges of deep gorges where the wind whistled through the canyons, carrying the chill of the higher altitudes. By the third day, physical exhaustion began to settle over the travelers like a heavy woolen blanket. The dust of the road caked their sandals, drying their skin and parching their throats with every breath. The crowds had thinned out, many travelers had branched off toward larger towns or taken alternative routes, leaving Joseph and Mary to contend with the lonely, imposing majesty of the Judean wilderness. Joseph walked faithfully at the donkey's side, his hand never leaving the lead rope, his eyes constantly scanning the path ahead for loose stones or steep inclines. Every time Mary shifted her weight, wincing slightly against the constant, jarring motion of the animal, Joseph felt a sharp pang of anguish in his chest. He would stop the donkey, offering her water from the skin and urging her to rest beneath the sparse shade of a wild pistachio tree. "Are you holding, Mary?" he asked one afternoon, his voice thick with concern as he wiped the grey dust from his brow. Mary smiled, though her face was pale with fatigue. Her eyes shone with a steady, inner light that seemed entirely detached from the aching muscles of her body. "The road is long, Joseph, but we are sustained. Every step brings us closer to the place appointed. Look at the sky, the day is holding for us." Indeed, the sky above the Judean ridges was a vast, unbroken expanse of brilliant blue, fading into pale amber as the sun began its slow descent toward the western horizon. But with the setting sun came a sudden, dramatic drop in temperature. The warmth of the day vanished instantly, replaced by a biting mountain wind that swept down from the heights, carrying the sharp, clean scent of crushed wild thyme and dry desert earth. They found shelter for the night in the lee of a ruined stone sheepfold just off the path. The structure consisted of low, crumbling walls of dry-stacked limestone, open to the star-studded sky. Joseph worked quickly, gathering dried twigs and stubborn roots of desert scrub to kindle a small, crackling fire against the evening chill. He spread a coarse woolen cloak over a bed of dry grass for Mary, urging her close to the warmth of the flames. Sitting side by side in the flickering firelight, the vast silence of the wilderness enclosed them. Above their heads, the night sky opened up in a breathtaking display of cosmic depth. Without the interference of city lights, the stars burned like white-hot embers scattered across a velvet abyss. Constellations that had guided shepherds and nomads for millennia wheeled slowly across the heavens, magnificent and indifferent to the smallness of human suffering down below. Mary leaned her head back against Joseph's shoulder, feeling the solid, dependable warmth of his body. The baby within her stirred, a gentle, rhythmic movement that sent a wave of profound peace washing over her spirit. "Joseph," she whispered softly, her voice barely audible above the crackle of the wood. "Do you ever wonder why it must be this way? Why such a great promise should come through such small, quiet doors?" Joseph looked down at her, his calloused hand coming up to rest gently over her own. He watched the dancing amber light play across the contours of her face, seeing not just the young woman he had promised to love, but a vessel of unspeakable holiness. "I think," Joseph murmured slowly, choosing his words with the careful precision of a man who worked with stubborn materials, "that greatness rarely announces itself with trumpets, Mary. The most enduring things, the roots of the olive tree, the foundations of a house, the quiet devotion of a heart, they all grow in the dark, away from the notice of kings. Caesar writes his decrees on parchment, and he thinks he commands the world. But he is only moving pieces on a board he does not understand. We are walking toward something far greater than any empire can compass." Mary smiled in the dark, comforted by the profound wisdom that lived beneath her husband's rough exterior. They sat together in the silence of the Judean hills, two ordinary souls cradling the secret of the universe beneath a canopy of ancient stars, while the world slept on, entirely unaware that the dawn of a new era was quietly drawing near. By the fifth day, the terrain had grown even more severe, a desolate maze of white limestone hills that rose and fell like frozen waves of chalk. But then, cresting a final, wind-scoured ridge, the landscape opened up to reveal a wide, fertile basin surrounded by terrace slopes of olive groves and barley fields. There, perched upon the limestone ridge like an ancient fortress of stone, lay Bethlehem. Even from a distance, the town looked different than it had in years past. A restless, chaotic energy hung over the settlement. The narrow, winding lanes that typically bustled with local farmers and weavers were now choked with an unprecedented multitude of travelers. Every courtyard, every open patch of ground, and every flat rooftop was crowded with tents, tethered donkeys, and restless families who had arrived from the farthest corners of the diaspora to register their names in the land of their fathers. As Joseph and Mary guided their weary donkey down the slope and entered through the town's main gate, the noise struck them like a physical wave. Shouts of merchants, the braying of livestock, the crying of tired children, and the endless hum of anxious voices filled the chalk dust-choked air. The late afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on the packed earth of the crowded marketplace, reflecting blinding white light off the stone walls of the houses. Joseph's heart sank as he looked at the sheer scale of the displacement. People had spilled out of the houses and into the streets. Families were sleeping in public squares and under the sparse shade of olive trees outside the town walls. Determined to find a decent shelter for Mary, Joseph began the grueling task of moving from inn to inn. He pushed his way through the dense throngs of people, holding the donkey's lead rope tightly in his calloused hand, while Mary sat quietly atop the animal, masking her profound physical exhaustion with an expression of serene endurance. At the first inn, a large, two-story stone structure with an interior courtyard packed with travelers, Joseph approached the innkeeper, a harassed man whose tunic was stained with sweat and wine, shouting orders to frantic servants. "Do you have a room?" Joseph asked, raising his voice above the din. "Even a corner under the eaves? Anything for my wife." The innkeeper didn't even stop to look them in the eye. He threw his hands up in exasperation, his face flushed with the stress of the overwhelming crowds. "Rooms? Every bed is taken 10 times over. The courtyard is full, the stables are overflowing, the very roof is crowded with men from the north. Try the lower town, though you won't find a square foot of stone that isn't spoken for. Caesar has entered the world into my courtyard today." With a curt nod, Joseph turned back to Mary. She offered a soft, understanding look, urging him onward. For hours, they searched every corner of Bethlehem. Joseph knocked on heavy wooden doors of private homes, appealing to the traditional hospitality of the region, only to be met by apologetic shakes of the head or stern refusals from homeowners whose own houses were packed to bursting with visiting relatives. The shadows lengthened, stretching long and dark across the dusty streets, and the temperature began its rapid, merciless descent from the heat of the day into the biting chill of the Judean night. Mary's breathing had grown shallower, and the persistent, heavy contractions began to pulse with a steady, unmistakable rhythm. The time was approaching with the swift, inexorable certainty of the tides. Panic, sharp and cold, threatened to pierce Joseph's composure. He looked at the indifferent faces of the bustling crowds, feeling utterly alone in the middle of a multitude. If she gave birth in the open street, exposed to the freezing wind and the staring eyes of strangers, he would have failed her. "Joseph," Mary said, her voice remarkably calm, though her hand gripped the wooden crossbar of the pack saddle tightly as another wave of pain passed through her. "Look there. At the edge of the hill." Joseph followed her gaze. Carved into the steep limestone slope just below the bustling terraces of the town was a series of ancient cave openings, traditionally used as stables and shelters for livestock during the winter months. A narrow path wound down through the chalky rock, away from the noise and confusion of the crowded streets above, leading to a quiet, subterranean recess set deep into the living earth. Without a word, Joseph urged the donkey down the steep, descending path. The clamor of the marketplace began to fade, replaced by a deep, resonant silence that seemed to drop like a curtain between the chaotic world of men and the sacred stillness of the earth. They reached the mouth of the primary cave. The interior was vast, cool, and shadowed, shielded from the biting wind by the natural overhang of the solid rock. The air here carried a rich, earthy aroma, the dry, sweet smell of sun-cured hay, the musky scent of resting livestock, and the mineral dampness of ancient limestone. Several sheep and a patient, gentle-eyed ox stood in the shadows, turning their heavy heads to watch the newcomers with soft, dark eyes that held no judgment, only a deep, unhurried tranquility. It was not a palace. It was not even a proper room. It was a shelter carved out of the primeval rock, humble, drafty, and crude. Yet, as Joseph stepped inside and looked around the shadowy cavern, a profound sense of relief washed over him. Here, there were no staring crowds, no clamoring merchants, no indifferent officials of the empire. There was only the solid earth, the quiet breathing of the animals, and the sanctuary of the stone. "This is it, Mary," Joseph said softly, his voice echoing gently off the damp limestone walls. He began to clear a space near the dry hay, spreading his own woolen cloak and blankets over the packed earth to create a clean, soft resting place. "It is sheltered. It is quiet." Mary dismounted with Joseph's steady assistance, leaning against him as her feet touched the ground. She looked around the cavern, her eyes adjusting to the dim, amber light cast by the small clay oil lamp Joseph had quickly lit and set upon a protruding ledge of rock. The flame flickered, casting long, dancing shadows that stretched across the stone ceiling, turning the rough-hewn walls into a tapestry of gold and velvet dark. "It is perfect, Joseph," Mary whispered, a serene smile touching her lips as she sank down onto the prepared blankets. "The world is noisy above us, but here there is room for heaven to breathe." Outside the cave mouth, the night deepened, and the brilliant canopy of the Judean stars wheeled across the sky. Far off in the rolling pastures beyond the town, simple men sat huddled around a dying fire, watching over their flocks in the dark, entirely unaware that the silence of the night was about to be shattered by a light that would pierce the deepest shadows of human history. Within the quiet womb of the earth, sheltered by stone and cradled by the gentle breath of creation, the ordinary world fell away, leaving only the steady, patient heartbeat of expectation. The Judean stars wheeled across the vast, indigo vault of the sky, burning with a cold and ancient brilliance that had watched over empires rise and fall into the dust. Far off in the rolling pastures beyond the town, simple men sat huddled around a dying fire, watching over their flocks in the dark, entirely unaware that the silence of the night was about to be shattered by a light that would pierce the deepest shadows of human history. Within the quiet womb of the earth, sheltered by stone and cradled by the gentle breath of creation, the ordinary world fell away, leaving only the steady, patient heartbeat of expectation. Weeks before the stone walls of the stable ever cradled them, that expectation had taken root in the dust of Nazareth, in a small, whitewashed stone cottage where the scent of cedar shavings and sun-baked earth lingered in the courtyard. There, history did not arrive with the blare of trumpets or the thundering hooves of imperial cavalry, but with the quiet scratching of a reed pen upon parchment and the heavy tread of sandals on a dirt road. An edict had come down from Rome, whispered from the marble halls of the Palatine Hill across the glittering expanse of the Mediterranean, crossing dusty provincial borders until it settled like a shroud of grey dust over the hills of Galilee. Caesar Augustus, master of the known world, had decreed that the entire inhabited earth should be registered. To the emperor in his cool marble villa, the command was a stroke of administrative precision, a neat accounting of souls and taxable property across 100 conquered nations. But to the inhabitants of the small, forgotten villages clinging to the limestone ridges of Judea and Galilee, the decree was a heavy, disruptive burden. It meant uprooting lives, abandoning small plots of stony soil, and embarking on long, perilous journeys dictated not by personal choice, but by the distant, indifferent will of a sovereign who did not even know their names. In the small carpentry workshop of Nazareth, the news arrived on a warm afternoon when the air hummed with the dry buzzing of cicadas. Joseph stood by the rough wooden workbench, his calloused hands resting on the edge of a newly planed beam of olive wood. The pale sawdust clung to the dark wool of his tunic, catching the slant of golden sunlight that poured through the open doorway. He had been fitting a mortise and tenon joint, his movement slow and deliberate, measured by the quiet rhythm of a life built on patience and honest labor. When the village crier's voice echoed up the narrow, winding lane, proclaiming the mandatory journey to the city of one's ancestors, a heavy silence settled over the courtyard. Joseph lifted his head, his dark eyes darkening with a complex web of thoughts. He thought of the road ahead, a journey of some 80 or 90 miles southward through the treacherous, brigand-infested hills of Samaria and Judea. He thought of the rocky tracks, the steep ascents, the unpredictable autumn weather that could turn dry wadis into raging torrents of muddy water with a single storm. And then he looked toward the doorway of the inner room, where Mary sat quietly in the soft, filtered light. She was resting against a low wall, her hands folded gently over her shawl, her gaze fixed on something far beyond the mud-brick walls of the cottage. Even in the stillness, there was an unmistakable gravity about her, a quiet, luminous composure that seemed to insulate her from the sudden panic of the village outside. She carried within her an immense, staggering divine calling, a mystery so profound that it frequently left Joseph breathless with a mixture of reverent awe and sudden, sharp protective fear. When Mary turned her head and met his gaze, there was no fear in her dark eyes, only a steady, unshakable trust that seemed to quiet the rising storm of anxiety in Joseph's chest. She knew what the decree meant. She knew that her time was drawing near, that the child she carried beneath her heart would soon enter a world that was fractured, suspicious, and tightly bound by the iron laws of an occupying empire. Yet, as Joseph walked across the earthen floor and stood before her, the anxiety that had threatened to overwhelm him began to transform into a deep, stubborn resolve. He was a man of quiet loyalty, rooted in the ancient lineage of David, and though his hands were accustomed to shaping wood rather than steering the course of nations, he knew his purpose with absolute clarity. He would be her shield against the hard road. He would guard her through every desolate mile. Preparations for the journey began before dawn the following morning, while the stars still hung low and bright over the sleeping hills of Galilee. The air was crisp, carrying the sharp, clean scent of dew-kissed rosemary and dry earth. Joseph moved quietly in the courtyard, checking the girth of the small, sturdy donkey that would carry Mary through the steeper passes. He packed 2 woolen cloaks, a small leather water skin, a modest bag of dried figs and flatbread, and a few wooden tools he might need for unexpected repairs along the way. Every movement was deliberate, charged with a subdued tension. They were leaving behind the only home they had known, stepping out of the relative safety of familiar walls and into the unpredictable currents of a world driven by imperial power. Yet as they finally stepped through the wooden gate of the courtyard and onto the dusty path leading south, the first rays of the sun crested the eastern hills, casting a warm, amber light across Mary's face. She looked toward the horizon with a quiet steadfastness, her steps matching the steady, unhurried pace of Joseph beside her. Their path wound steadily southward, descending from the green, terraced hills of Galilee into the wide, fertile expanse of the Jezreel Valley. The landscape shifted around them like the turning pages of an ancient book. The olive groves and vineyards of the north gradually gave way to the sun-baked, rolling brown hills of Samaria, where the limestone outcroppings baked beneath a relentless autumn sun. For days, they walked in the company of other travelers, distant cousins, weary merchants, and families displaced by the very same imperial decree. The roads were thick with dust that rose in pale, choking clouds with every footstep, coating their sandals and turning the wool of their garments a uniform shade of grey. The noise was incessant, the bleating of livestock, the shouts of muleteers, the rhythmic creak of wooden carts, and the murmur of endless complaints about the cruelty of taxation and the arrogance of Rome. Through it all, Joseph remained a constant, silent anchor. He walked beside the donkey, his hand frequently resting reassuringly on its flank, his eye scanning every turn of the road, watching for the telltale glint of sunlight on Roman bronze or the suspicious grouping of strangers near the rocky outcroppings. Whenever the steepness of the path threatened to exhaust her, he insisted on resting beneath the sparse shade of a terebinth tree, offering her cool water from the leather skin and speaking words of quiet encouragement that carried the deep, resonant timbre of solid oak. Mary endured the physical toll of the journey with a remarkable grace that seemed to defy her youth. Her body ached with the heavy, persistent fatigue of a woman near the end of a long pregnancy, and the constant motion of the road wrung the strength from her limbs. Yet her spirit remained remarkably clear. In the quiet intervals between the chatter of fellow travelers, her mind wandered into deep, contemplative spaces. She thought of the angel's words months ago in the quiet room at Nazareth, of the impossible promise that had been planted within her like a seed in winter soil. She felt the gentle, unmistakable movement of the child within her, a subtle reminder of life persisting beneath the harsh, indifferent machinery of the empire. She realized with profound clarity how God's providence was moving through the very mechanisms of human pride. Caesar in his marble palace believed he was numbering his subjects to cement his own glory, marshalling the census as an instrument of control. Yet that very decree was gently, inexorably guiding the steps of an obscure carpenter and a young maiden from Galilee toward a little town in the southern hills, fulfilling an ancient prophecy whispered centuries before by Micah, that out of Bethlehem, small though it was among the clans of Judah, would come forth the one who was to be ruler. Heaven and earth were converging in the quiet spaces between their footsteps. The grand, sweeping drama of redemption was playing out not in the halls of power, but on the dusty, forgotten footpaths trodden by the poor. As the days bled into one another, the terrain grew rougher, more severe. The soft greens of the north faded entirely, replaced by the stark, bleached limestone of the Judean wilderness. The hills rose up like ancient, weathered bones against the pale sky, steep and forbidding, cut by deep, shadowed ravines where the wind moaned with a lonely, hollow sound. The air here was thinner, carrying the sharp, clean scent of crushed wild thyme and dry desert dust that caught in the throat with every breath. By the time they reached the outskirts of Judea, the sun was beginning its slow descent toward the western horizon, painting the limestone ridges in shades of bruised purple, amber, and deep rose. The shadows lengthened, stretching across the valleys like quiet fingers pointing the way forward. And then, rising against the skyline ahead of them, came Bethlehem. It was not a grand city of towering walls and gleaming gates, but a sprawling, ancient settlement perched upon the spine of a limestone ridge, overlooking terraced hillsides heavy with olive trees and vineyards. From a distance, it looked peaceful, almost timeless, glowing softly in the dying light of the afternoon. Yet as Joseph and Mary drew closer to the gates, the illusion of peacefulness dissolved into a chaotic, overwhelming reality. The town was utterly overwhelmed. Every inn, every courtyard, every available alcove and flat rooftop was packed to the point of bursting with travelers who had arrived from all corners of the land to register in the city of their ancestral house. The narrow streets were choked with a restless, anxious crowd. Donkeys brayed in frustration against stone walls, merchants shouted over the din, trying to sell meager provisions at inflated prices, children cried from exhaustion, and the heavy smell of wood smoke, sweat, and animal manure hung thickly in the cool evening air. Lanterns and small clay oil lamps were being lit along the winding pathways, casting a warm, flickering amber glow that danced across the weather-beaten faces of hundreds of weary strangers. Joseph guided the donkey carefully through the press of bodies, his shoulders tense as he navigated the steep, uneven steps of the main street. He could feel Mary swaying slightly in the saddle, her fatigue having reached a profound, fragile limit. Without a word, he kept his hand firmly on the halter, cutting a path through the throng toward the larger inns that clustered near the town's central marketplace. At the first inn, a large, two-story stone structure with an interior courtyard, Joseph pushed his way through the dense crowd gathered around the heavy wooden doorway. The innkeeper, a heavy-set man with a sweat-beaded forehead and an expression of exhausted exasperation, was waving his hands frantically, turning away a dozen desperate men at once. "There is no room," the innkeeper shouted over the din, his voice cracked and raw. "Not a corner, not a bench, not a square foot of floor space left. The stables are full of travelers' beasts, and the straw in the yard is covered 3 deep with sleeping men. Go on, find shelter elsewhere." Joseph stepped forward, his voice steady despite the sinking weight in his chest. "Listen, friend," he began, his tone urgent yet respectful. "My wife is with child. She cannot walk further. Surely there is somewhere." The innkeeper barely glanced at him, his eyes already scanning the sea of faces behind Joseph for the next paying customer. "I have nothing," he snapped, shaking his head. "Every room is taken by men of standing who arrived before the sun crested the hill. I am sorry, traveler, but the town is full. There is simply nothing here." He turned his back, slamming a heavy wooden shutter over a window to emphasize his finality. For a moment, Joseph stood frozen in the dimming light, a cold knot of anxiety tightening in his stomach. He looked back at Mary. She sat quietly upon the donkey, her face pale in the flickering amber glow of a nearby wall lamp. She offered him a faint, reassuring smile, a gesture of such profound gentleness and strength that it pierced straight through his worry, reminding him of the unseen presence that walked with them. "Come," Mary said softly, her voice calm and clear above the chaos of the street. "We will find a place." "We are not abandoned." Joseph nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat, and turned the donkey away from the crowded courtyard. They wandered down a narrower, quieter lane that branched off from the main thoroughfare, leading away from the noisy marketplace toward the edge of the ridge where the town dissolved into the limestone hillside. Here, the noise of the crowd began to fade, replaced by the steady whispering of the evening wind sighing through the olive branches. The houses built into this side of the hill were ancient, many of them incorporating natural limestone caves that gaped like dark, welcoming mouths in the rock face. These caves were frequently used as stables and storage cellars, protected from the biting winter winds and cool in the heat of summer. As they rounded a sharp bend in the path, Joseph noticed a low-ceilinged stone facade built against the natural slope of the hill. A small clay oil lamp burned on a stone ledge beside the heavy wooden door of the dwelling above, casting a warm, golden pool of light across the dirt path. Below the dwelling, carved deep into the living rock of the hillside, was a subterranean stable cave. Joseph tied the donkey to a wooden stake near the entrance and stepped cautiously down into the cool, shadowed interior. The air inside was thick with a rich, comforting earthy aroma, the dry scent of ancient straw, sun-cured hay, the mineral dampness of limestone, and the gentle, rhythmic breathing of several cattle and sheep that rested quietly in the stalls. A few wooden mangers stood against the rough-hewn stone walls, filled with sweet-smelling fodder. The cave was remarkably quiet, insulated from the frantic turmoil of the overcrowded town above by thick layers of stone and earth. Joseph stood in the center of the cave for a long moment, listening to the soft, rhythmic chewing of an ox in the shadows and the low, contented rustle of straw. It was humble, utterly devoid of comfort or status, yet it possessed a profound, sheltering peace. It was a place untouched by the pride of empires or the anxious striving of men. He turned and walked back out into the cool evening air, gently helping Mary down from the donkey. As her feet touched the ground, she leaned against him for a brief moment, letting out a long, quiet breath as the strain of the journey began to melt away from her frame. Together, they walked down the stone steps into the warm shelter of the cave. The flickering, amber glow of the small oil lamp they brought inside cast long, dancing shadows against the damp limestone walls, softening the rough edges of the stone and turning the humble stable into a sanctuary. Joseph quickly set to work, gathering clean, dry straw from the corner to fashion a soft pallet near the back of the cave, away from the drafts near the entrance. He spread one of their woolen cloaks over the straw, creating a simple, warm resting place. Mary knelt upon the pallet, her hands resting on the rough wool, her gaze wandering slowly around the quiet, dimly lit cavern. The animals stirred gently in the darkness, turning their large, dark eyes toward the newcomers with a tranquil, unthreatening curiosity. Their steady, rhythmic breathing filled the space like a low, comforting lullaby, echoing softly off the damp limestone walls. Outside, the Judean night deepened, and the distant stars continued their eternal wheeling across the sky. The world above remained locked in its frantic routine, entirely unconscious of the silent miracle taking shape within the womb of the earth. In the quiet humility of the stone cave, wrapped in the scent of dry hay and earth, the long journey had reached its end. The stage was set, the silence was absolute, and the universe held its breath as the light prepared to pierce the deepest shadows of human history. The dust of the road had finally settled from their skin, yet the long, aching memory of the journey clung to Joseph and Mary like a second garment. For days, under the vast, indifferent expanse of the Judean sky, they had pressed southward from the green hills of Galilee, navigating the rocky switchbacks and dry riverbeds that wound their way toward the city of David. Joseph walked beside the small, weary donkey, his calloused hand resting gently upon the rough-woven blanket draped over its back. Every step he took sent a dull, familiar ache radiating upward from the soles of his feet through his tired legs, but he did not allow his posture to slump. His eyes remained fixed on the horizon, scanning the undulating contours of the hills for any sign of rough terrain, any potential hazard that might threaten the young woman riding quietly behind him. Mary sat with her hands folded over her swollen stomach, her head bowed slightly against the rising chill of the evening wind. The fabric of her blue mantle was stiff with the fine, pale dust of the limestone tracks, and her lips were dry, yet her expression possessed an extraordinary, unearthly composure. Inside her, a quiet universe was stirring, a profound mystery unfolding with the steady, inexorable rhythm of the tides. She did not complain about the jolting gait of the beast, nor did she speak of the heavy fatigue that weighed upon her bones. Instead, her mind remained turned inward, cradling the sacred promise that hummed through her veins like a distant, beautiful song. They had left Nazareth under a cloud of whispered judgments and averted glances, the neighbors of their small village unable to look past the unconventional grace of her condition. Joseph remembered the sharp sting of those initial doubts, the sleepless nights when the weight of public shame had pressed upon his chest like a stone. But an angel had spoken to him in the deep silence of a dream, stripping away his fear and replacing it with an unshakable, fierce devotion. He was a carpenter, a man accustomed to measuring wood by straight lines and square angles, but he had learned that the architecture of God's design often defied human blueprints. He was here to protect, to provide, and to stand as a quiet shield between this holy mystery and a fractured world. As the sun began its slow, bruised descent behind the western ridges, casting long, purple shadows across the terraced hillsides, the ancient town of Bethlehem finally came into view. It was not the quiet, welcoming sanctuary they might have longed for after nearly 90 miles of travel. From a distance, Bethlehem looked less like a town and more like a restless hive disturbed by an unseen hand. Smoke from countless cooking fires rose into the indigo twilight, mingling with the heavy dust kicked up by hundreds of travelers, merchants, and tax-ridden subjects who had converged upon the ancestral home of King David from every corner of the empire. Caesar Augustus had decreed that the whole world should be taxed, and the administrative machinery of Rome had set its heavy gears in motion, dragging ordinary families from their hearths and driving them into the crowded streets of their ancestral villages. As Joseph and Mary drew closer to the town gates, the noise grew into a low, restless roar. The narrow, winding lanes were choked with pack animals, barking dogs, and the raised voices of frustrated innkeepers and exhausted travelers shouting over one another in a dozen different dialects of Aramaic, Greek, and Latin. Torches flared in iron brackets along the stone walls, casting a flickering, jaundiced light over faces etched with anxiety and weariness. Joseph guided the donkey deeper into the press of the crowd, his shoulder instinctively blocking a stray, heavily laden camel that lurched past with a low, disgruntled groan. He looked down at Mary, his brow furrowed with deep concern. The flickering torchlight caught the pale, drawn look on her face, and the sight of her quiet endurance twisted something tight and painful in his chest. "Just a little further," Joseph murmured, his voice hoarse from the dust and strain of the day. "We will find a place. Someone must have a corner, a hearth where you can rest." Mary offered him a faint, reassuring smile, though her hand gripped the wooden pommel of the saddle more tightly as a sharp, sudden wave of pain rippled through her lower back. She breathed through it slowly, closing her eyes for a brief moment until the spasm subsided, leaving her shivering slightly in the cooling air. They began their search at the sprawling inn near the western gate, a two-story limestone building with a central courtyard that was already overflowing with humanity. Piles of baggage lined the stone flagstones, and men huddled around cold campfires, arguing politics, the price of grain, and the endless delays of the Roman census. Joseph pushed his way through the courtyard, leaving Mary and the donkey near the shadowed archway of the entrance. He approached the raised wooden platform where the innkeeper, a heavyset man with a sweat-beaded forehead and an expression of profound exhaustion, was fruitlessly attempting to manage a ledger by the light of a sputtering tallow candle. "There is no room," the innkeeper snapped before Joseph could even open his mouth, his hand waving dismissively toward the crowded courtyard. "Every bed is taken. The stables are full of other men's livestock. The roof is covered with sleeping travelers. Do not ask me for a corner, friend, for I have not even a square foot of floor space left to give." "Please," Joseph said, his voice dropping to a low, urgent register as he leaned across the wooden desk. "My wife is with child. She cannot spend the night out in the open air. Surely there is something, a storage room, a shed, anything out of the wind." The innkeeper looked up, his weary eyes briefly meeting Joseph's. There was no malice in the man's gaze, only a hollow, bone-deep apathy born of too many demands and too little space. He spread his hands in a gesture of helpless finality. "I tell you, traveler, there is nothing. The town is bursting at the seams. Try the upper market, though you will find the same answer there." Joseph turned away, a heavy sense of failure settling over his shoulders. He walked back to Mary, hating the words he had to deliver, yet knowing they must face the reality of their situation. But before he could speak, Mary looked past him toward the steep, sloping path that led down the rocky limestone hillside away from the clamor of the central square. "Joseph," she said softly, nodding toward the descending path. "Look there." Carved directly into the white limestone face of the hill beneath the terraced foundations of the town lay a series of natural caves, long used by local shepherds and villagers as subterranean shelters for their flocks during the bitter winter months. A rough stone wall had been built across the mouth of the largest cave, pierced by a low wooden door that stood slightly ajar. Faint ribbons of golden light spilled from within, and the distinct, comforting smell of dry hay, warm earth, and resting livestock drifted up on the evening breeze. It was humble, far removed from the comfort of any human dwelling, let alone the grandeur that human imagination might assign to the birthplace of a king. But as Joseph looked down at the dark, quiet opening, a profound sense of recognition washed over him. The noise of the crowded streets above faded into a distant, muffled hum, swallowed up by the thick, ancient silence of the earth. "Come," Joseph said, his voice steadying with a sudden, deep resolve. He took the donkey's lead rope in hand and guided the animal down the winding stone track toward the shelter of the cave. The transition from the frantic, lamplit chaos of Bethlehem streets to the subterranean quiet of the stable was absolute. As they passed through the low wooden doorway, the frantic noise of the world outside was instantly muted, replaced by an encompassing, womb-like stillness. The interior was spacious, its vaulted ceiling supported by rough-hewn pillars of natural rock that had been polished smooth by centuries of use. Along the back wall, deep stone mangers carved directly out of the living limestone were filled with sweet-smelling, dry straw. A few sheep and a docile ox stood near the far corner, turning their heads lazily to watch the newcomers enter. Their breathing was slow, deep, and rhythmic, filling the damp air with a gentle, ambient warmth that instantly drove back the chill of the Judean night. Joseph immediately set to work, his movements efficient and purposeful. He cleared a patch of smooth stone near the center of the cave, sweeping away loose pebbles and dust with a bundle of twigs before laying down several thick, clean layers of fresh hay. Over this, he spread their traveling blankets, creating a soft, secure pallet protected from the cold dampness of the floor. "Here, Mary," he said gently, turning to help her down from the donkey. Mary slid gracefully from the saddle into his waiting arms. For a moment, she leaned against his chest, feeling the steady, reassuring thud of his heart beneath his tunic. The physical toll of the journey was immense, and her body felt fragile, like fine glass stretched to its absolute limit, yet her spirit remained bright and clear, anchored in a deep, interior peace. "Thank you, Joseph," she whispered, her fingers resting lightly on his arm. "You have carried us well." "We are safe here," he replied, his voice thick with emotion as he led her to the pallet of blankets and helped her lie down. "You rest. I will tend to the animals and secure the door." He busied himself with small, necessary tasks, wanting to make the rough limestone cavern as hospitable as human hands could manage. He fed the quiet ox a handful of fresh straw, filled a small wooden trough with water, and wedged the heavy wooden door more securely against the rising night wind, leaving just enough space for fresh air to circulate. As the hours drifted past midnight, the atmosphere within the cave shifted. The world outside grew completely still, locked in the deep, freezing hush of the desert night. Inside, the only sounds were the soft, rhythmic chewing of the livestock and the steady, measured breathing of Joseph and Mary. The small clay oil lamp that Joseph had placed on a projecting ledge of rock cast a warm, amber glow against the damp stone walls, stretching their shadows into long, graceful shapes that danced gently in the flickering draft. In that amber light, the cave lost its rough, subterranean harshness, transforming into a sacred sanctuary carved out of the very heart of the earth. Then, without warning, the quiet air shifted. Mary caught her breath, her hands tightening instinctively into the folds of the woolen blanket beneath her. A wave of profound, transcendent energy swept through the cavern, eclipsing the physical pain with an overwhelming sense of divine presence. The air grew suddenly warm, charged with a shimmering, electric stillness that made the hairs on Joseph's arms stand on end. He looked up from where he had been sitting on an overturned crate near the entrance, his heart leaping into his throat. He saw Mary's eyes widen, not with fear, but with an astonishing, radiant awe, as she looked up toward the vaulted stone ceiling, the ordinary boundaries between heaven and earth dissolved in an instant. There was no sound of trumpets, no flashing lightning across the dark sky above, for God was working not through the thunderous display of empires, but through the terrifying, fragile beauty of a newborn breath. In the quiet center of the cave, amid the scent of dry hay and earth, the long-awaited light broke through the deepest darkness of human history. Mary let out a soft, trembling sigh of release as a tiny, piercing cry echoed off the damp limestone walls, a sound so small, so utterly defenseless, yet possessing a resonant power that shook the foundations of the cosmos. Joseph scrambled across the uneven floor, falling to his knees beside the pallet with hands that shook uncontrollably. Tears sprang unbidden to his eyes, blurring the warm amber light of the oil lamp as he looked down at the tiny, writhing form resting against Mary's chest. Gently, with infinite reverence, Mary gathered the infant into her arms, pulling him close to her heart. Her face was pale, glistening with a fine sheen of perspiration, but her smile was brighter than any sun that had ever risen over the hills of Judea. She reached for the simple strips of clean linen she had packed so carefully at the bottom of her wooden chest, the swaddling cloths prepared with her own hands in the quiet rooms of Nazareth. With steady, practiced fingers, she wrapped the child snugly, securing his tiny limbs against the cold air, just as generations of mothers had done before her. But as she laid him gently into the stone manger that Joseph had lined with fresh, sweet-smelling hay, the ordinary act took on an eternal weight. The manger, a feeding trough for beasts, now held the bread of life. The lowest place on earth had become the threshold of heaven. Joseph stood over them, his broad shoulders slightly bowed, his rough, calloused hands resting on the edge of the stone trough. He looked down at the child's face, illuminated by the golden glow of the lamp, and felt the last vestiges of his doubt and fear evaporate like morning mist under a desert sun. He was no longer just a humble carpenter from a despised village, he was the earthly guardian of the world's true dawn. He reached out, his thumb gently brushing the baby's tiny cheek, and felt a surge of fierce, protective love that anchored his soul forever. Outside, far away on the rolling, shadowed hills of Bethlehem where flocks of sheep huddled together against the biting wind, the ordinary rhythm of the night was suddenly shattered. The shepherds, rough, weathered men who lived on the margins of society, despised by the religious elite for their ceremonial uncleanness and forgotten by the powerful men who traded in taxes and wars, were sitting around a dying ember of brushwood, speaking in low, murmuring tones about the cold. Suddenly, the black dome of the sky above them tore open not with storm, but with blinding, radiant glory. An angel of the Lord stood before them, bathed in a celestial light that outshone the midday sun, casting long, sharp shadows across the terraced hills. The shepherds fell backward onto the rocky ground, shielding their eyes with dirt-stained hands, their hearts hammering against their ribs with a terror so profound it paralyzed their limbs. "Do not be afraid," a voice rang out, not loud, yet echoing with the resonance of 1,000 rolling waters, filling the vastness of the night sky. "For behold, I bring you good tidings of great joy which will be to all people. For there is born to you this day in the city of David a Savior, who is Christ the Lord. And this will be the sign to you, you will find a babe wrapped in swaddling cloths, lying in a manger." Before the shepherds could catch their breath, the sky above them blossomed with a multitude of the heavenly host, praising God and singing a song that vibrated through the very stones of the earth, glory to God in the highest, and on earth peace, goodwill toward men." Then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the heavenly light receded, melting back into the familiar, quiet canopy of stars. But the darkness that returned was no longer empty, it was pregnant with promise. The oldest of the shepherds, a man with a beard white as winter frost and eyes crinkled from decades of watching the night skies, slowly climbed to his feet. He looked at his companions, whose faces were pale and stunned in the dim starlight. "Did you hear?" the old shepherd whispered, his voice trembling with an overwhelming, inexplicable joy. "Did you see?" "The city of David," another breathed, scrambling up from the rocks. "A manger." They said a manger. Without another word, the shepherds abandoned their camp, leaving their sleeping flocks in the care of the dark hills, and began to run down the steep, rocky slopes toward the town. They did not pause to consider their own unworthiness, nor did they wonder how they would find a royal child in a place meant for cattle. They were driven by an urgent, magnetic pull that superseded all reason. At the same exact moment, thousands of miles away across the burning sands of the eastern deserts, another journey was reaching its climax. Under the sharp, piercing brilliance of a singular, wandering star that hung motionless in the eastern sky, a caravan of foreign sages, men who studied the ancient charts of the cosmos and the hidden rhythms of the universe, urged their weary camels forward. For months, they had followed that silent, golden guide across trackless wastes, enduring the blistering heat of the day and the freezing winds of the night, driven by a prophecy whispered among the ancient texts of diverse lands. They were seekers of truth, representatives of the great nations outside the covenant, yet their eyes had been opened to a light that belonged to the whole of creation. The star paused directly overhead, casting its long, steady beam downward into the rugged limestone hills of Judea, illuminating the small, unassuming village of Bethlehem, and finally, resting its gentle, brilliant finger upon the mouth of a dark, subterranean cave. Inside the stable, the air was suspended in a state of holy, unbroken peace. Mary sat quietly on the edge of the low stone pallet, her head resting against Joseph's shoulder as he stood beside her in the warm amber glow of the oil lamp. In the stone manger just a few feet away, the child slept on, his chest rising and falling with the quiet, untroubled rhythm of a new life securely held within the palms of the divine. The long road southward had ended. The dust had settled. The noise of the world above had faded into the vast, eternal silence of the earth. And in the humble quiet of the stable cave, heaven and earth had finally met, whispering a promise of light that the darkness could never overcome. Outside the low, uneven stone threshold of the cave, however, the world was far from quiet. The ancient town of Bethlehem, straddling the limestone ridge of the Judean hills, was swollen to bursting. Every courtyard, every flat rooftop, every narrow alleyway between the whitewashed stone houses was choked with the restless, breathing mass of humanity. The imperial decree issued by Caesar Augustus had reached into the farthest corners of the provinces, compelling every family to return to the city of their ancestral roots. For Joseph, whose lineage traced unbroken through the generations back to the shepherd King David, that ancient mandate meant a grueling, perilous journey from the hills of Galilee down through the Jordan Valley and up the steep, winding ascents of Judea. And now, having finally arrived at the destination of their exhausting pilgrimage, they found themselves swallowed by a sea of strangers. The air in the upper streets was thick and hazy, dense with the acrid smoke of 100 cooking fires burning dried olive wood and camel dung, mingled with the heavy, powdery dust churned up by thousands of sandaled feet and hooves. Donkeys brayed in the crowded enclosures, merchants shouted hoarsely over the din of haggling voices, children darted between the legs of weary travelers carrying leather water skins and woven baskets. Every doorway was blocked, every guest chamber packed chest to knee with men, women, and animals brought together by the stroke of a distant, indifferent pen in Rome. Up until this moment, Joseph had kept his fears locked deep within the quiet chambers of his heart. For days, walking beside the donkey that carried Mary through the rocky defiles and the shadows of the ravines, his primary focus had been the simple, relentless mechanics of survival, placing his calloused hand upon the animal's flank, watching the horizon for sudden shifts in the weather, choosing the path of least resistance for his young wife. But as the shadows lengthened across the stone facades of Bethlehem and the orange embers of twilight began to wink out across the hillsides, a cold, heavy knot of anxiety began to form in his chest. He had knocked on every door from the northern gate to the eastern wall. He had stood in the crowded courtyards of local inns, his knuckles rapping against sturdy timber lintels, watching exhausted innkeepers shake their heads before the first words could even leave his mouth. There was no room. Not a cot, not a bench, not even a square foot of packed dirt beneath a lean-to roof. The town was overflowing, a vessel filled far beyond capacity, spilling its contents out into the rocky fields. Now, standing just inside the entrance of the subterranean stable cave, Joseph let out a slow, tremulous breath that tasted of dust and cool limestone. He turned his gaze back toward the interior, his calloused hand resting heavily on the rough wooden frame of his carpenter's tools, which were still strapped securely to the pack saddle. The contrast between the frantic, suffocating chaos of the streets above and the tranquil sanctuary of this hollowed-out earth was absolute. Here, the frantic murmurs of the census takers and the clamor of the market dissolved into a deep, velvety quiet. The air, though scented richly with the earthy aroma of dry straw, sun-cured barley, and the warm, musk-like breath of resting livestock, felt infinitely more breathable than the smoke-choked lanes outside. Mary sat upon a thick woolen blanket spread carefully over the clean straw, her posture relaxed yet imbued with that innate, unshakable grace that had sustained them both through every trial of the journey. The flickering amber light of the small clay oil lamp danced across the gentle curves of her face, illuminating the soft sweep of her dark hair and the quiet, luminous depth of her dark eyes. She looked down at the newborn resting in the manger, swaddled securely in simple, clean strips of linen that Joseph had prudently packed weeks ago in Nazareth, and a tender, knowing smile touched the corners of her lips. She did not look like a woman displaced, nor did she carry the bitter residue of resentment toward a town that had turned its back on her in her hour of greatest need. To Mary, the convergence of these humble circumstances felt less like an accident of history and more like the deliberate, whispering design of the Almighty. The prophets of old had spoken of Bethlehem as a place of small beginnings, a town too insignificant to be counted among the clans of Judah, yet destined from the foundations of the world to bring forth a ruler whose origins were from of old, from ancient days. In the quiet darkness of this cave, far removed from the pomp of palaces and the hollow praise of courts, the dignity of heaven's design was laid bare in its purest, most unadorned form. Yet Joseph, wiping a layer of sweat and grey road dust from his forehead with the back of a weather-beaten hand, struggled to quiet the protective storm raging within his own thoughts. He walked softly across the uneven stone floor, his footsteps muffled by the thick bedding of the animals, and knelt beside Mary. "The crowds outside are relentless, Mary," Joseph murmured, his voice a low, gravelly rumble imbued with a profound, aching tenderness. He reached out, his thick, scarred fingers gently brushing against her sleeve. "Even the courtyards are filled to the point of suffocation. When I spoke with the innkeeper down by the market square, a man nearly broken by the endless stream of travelers demanding beds, he had nothing left to give. Not a single corner under a permanent roof." Mary lifted her gaze from the sleeping child, turning her calm, steady eyes toward her husband. The worry etched into the lines around his eyes, lines forged by years of honest labor with plane and chisel, now deepened by the crushing weight of responsibility, stirred a quiet well of sympathy within her. She placed her hand over his calloused knuckles, feeling the familiar, grounding warmth of his skin. "Look around you, Joseph," Mary whispered softly, her voice carrying a musical resonance that seemed to push back the encroaching shadows of the cave. "Is this not shelter? Is there not a roof of solid stone above our heads, protecting us from the cold night wind? Are we not hidden away from the noise and the judgment of a world that does not yet understand what has been placed into our care?" Joseph blinked, allowing his gaze to wander from Mary's face out toward the dark mouth of the cave. Beyond the stone threshold, the first pale wash of moonlight was beginning to silver the rugged contours of the Judean hills, casting long, stark shadows across the path. He listened closely. From the upper terraces of the town came the distant, discordant hum of human voices, arguing over coin, complaining about the scarcity of bread, worrying over the arbitrary demands of a distant empire. And yet, right here, just a few paces removed from that restless tide, there was only the rhythmic, comforting breathing of the ox and the gentle, stirring rustle of sheep settling down for the night. "It is humble," Joseph conceded, a faint, self-deprecating smile finally breaking through the heavy armor of his anxiety. He shook his head slowly, letting out a long breath that seemed to carry away the last remnants of his daily panic. "When I imagined bringing my family to Bethlehem, I envisioned a proper house, a warm hearth prepared by kin, a place worthy of the child we carried. Instead, we have found ourselves sharing a shelter with beasts of burden." "And where else should he be born, Joseph?" Mary asked gently, her thumb tracing the rough surface of his hand. "The prophets wrote that he would be despised and rejected by men, acquainted with grief, born into the dust of the earth so that no one, no matter how low their station, could ever feel too far removed from his presence. The shepherds in the fields, the outcasts, the weary laborious, they will not find him behind the velvet curtains of a king's palace. They will find him here, in the quiet earth, wrapped in common cloth." As if responding to her words, a gentle movement stirred from the direction of the stone manger. The infant shifted slightly beneath his swaddling clothes, a soft, contented sigh escaping his lips. Joseph turned his head, watching with a heart swelling beyond measure as the child's tiny hand curled instinctively into a miniature fist, resting against his chest. All the doubts that had plagued Joseph during the long miles of the journey, the nagging whispers of inadequacy, the terrifying realization of his own human frailty in the face of a divine commission seemed to evaporate in the serene warmth of that small, holy space. He was not just a carpenter from a forgotten northern village anymore. He was the guardian chosen by heaven to watch over the dawn of a new age. Outside, unaware of the quiet miracle unfolding within the belly of the limestone hill, the village of Bethlehem began to settle into a restless, uneasy slumber. The fires in the courtyard slowly burned down from bright tongues of flame to glowing beds of red embers, casting a dull, copper-tinted haze over the rooftops. The shouting in the narrow lane subsided into occasional murmurs, the barking of stray dogs and the rhythmic clinking of hobbled pack animals shifting in the dark. In the fields surrounding the town, the very same ancient pastures where David had once watched his father's flocks beneath the vast, star-studded expanse of the Judean sky, other watchers kept vigil. A group of shepherds sat huddled together around a small, dying fire of thornbush, their heavy woolen cloaks pulled tight against the sharp, descending chill of the midnight air. These were men of the earth, toughened by isolation, wind, and the constant, vigilant defense of their sheep against wolves and marauding thieves. They lived on the margins of polite society, regarded by the religious elite of Jerusalem as ceremonially unclean, perpetually away from the temple, bound instead to the cyclical rhythms of birth, pasture, and slaughter. One of the older shepherds, an aging man named Amos whose face was a map of deep creases earned from decades under the blazing desert sun, leaned forward and tossed a dry branch onto the glowing coals. A flurry of bright orange sparks spiraled upward into the dark canopy of the night, disappearing quickly into the immensity of the cosmos. "The town is packed tighter than a sheepfold at shearing time," Amos murmured, his voice raspy from years of calling out across wide canyons. "I spoke with a merchant coming up from Jericho earlier today. He said every innkeeper in Bethlehem is turning people away by the dozens. Men sleeping in carts, families huddled under olive trees. It is a madhouse born of Caesar's greed." A younger shepherd, a lad named Eli whose eyes still held the bright, unclouded curiosity of youth, gazed up toward the towering ridge where the lights of Bethlehem flickered like distant, fallen stars. "Do you think they feel it, Amos?" Eli asked softly, pulling his cloak closer around his shoulders as a sudden gust of wind swept across the ridge, carrying with it the sharp, clean scent of crushed wild thyme. "The travelers up there? Do you think any of them know that something is shifting beneath our feet?" Amos let out a low, gravelly chuckle, shaking his head as he stared into the heart of the fire. "Most of them are too busy worrying about their taxes, their coins, and where they will find their next meal to notice the turning of the world, Eli. Men rarely notice the important things when they are blinded by the noise of their own affairs. The world moves on its grand, violent path, and empire builders carve up the map with their swords, never realizing that true power rarely makes a sound." As if in silent punctuation to his words, the vast canopy of the night sky above the Judean hills seemed to undergo a subtle, miraculous transformation. At first, it was merely a shift in the quality of the starlight, a sudden, crystalline clarity that made every constellation stand out with terrifying, diamond-like precision against the velvet blackness of space. Then, far to the east, across the distant, shadowy expanse of the Dead Sea and the high plateaus of Moab, a single point of light ignited with a brilliance that defied the natural order of the heavens. It was not a falling star, nor was it the erratic flash of a passing meteor. It hung suspended in the firmament, steady and radiant, casting a soft, silvery gold illumination that began to rival the light of the moon itself. The star pulsed with a slow, leaving rhythm, radiating an amber-white glow that seemed to reach across the immense gulf of space with a direct, personal intentionality. Eli dropped his wooden staff, standing up so abruptly that the resting sheep nearby stirred and shifted in the darkness. He pointed a trembling finger toward the eastern horizon, his breath catching in his throat. "Amos, look! Look at the east!" The older shepherd slowly raised his head, his weathered eyes tracking the direction of the boy's hand. When his gaze locked onto the brilliant new luminary hanging proudly above the jagged horizon, the pipe he had been holding slipped from his fingers and tumbled unheeded into the dust. For a long moment, Amos said nothing. The lines on his face seemed to smooth away in the unearthly, radiant wash of the star's amber beams, and an expression of profound, reverent awe settled over his features. "God in heaven," Amos whispered, his voice trembling with a mixture of fear and breathtaking realization. "I have seen the night sky over these hills for 60 years, Eli. I know every star by name. But this is something else entirely." Across the rolling hills and valleys of Judea, other eyes were drawn upward by the sudden, magnificent beacon. Farther east, beyond the borders of Israel, across the vast, windswept expanses of Mesopotamia and the ancient seat of Babylon, men of learning and science, scholars who spent their lives charting the movements of the cosmos, studying ancient scrolls, and seeking the hidden patterns of the universe, stood upon high stone observatories. They were magi, seekers of truth who had interpreted ancient prophecies written down centuries before by captive Hebrew scribes. For months, they had tracked the convergence of planets, calculating angles and alignments until their charts pointed unerringly toward the west. And now, seeing the star blazing forth in its full, majestic intensity, the leader of the Magi, an elder scholar with a beard silvered by decades of astronomical study, turned to his companions with a countenance of absolute resolve. "The time has come," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of a lifelong quest fulfilled. "The King has been born. The sign we have waited for has been given. Saddle the white camels, prepare the gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. We ride for Judea." Back in the quiet subterranean cave in Bethlehem, far removed from the royal courts of the East and the scholarly observatories of Babylon, the world felt suspended in a state of breathless anticipation. Joseph stood near the entrance of the stable, his eyes drawn upward through the natural opening of the rock formation toward that same magnificent star shining brightly above the town. The amber light of the heavenly body seemed to pierce straight through the darkness of the night, casting a gentle, welcoming beam directly down into the mouth of the cave, illuminating the rough stone manger where the child lay. Mary watched him from the shadows, her heart overflowing with a quiet, majestic peace. She reached down, her fingers lightly touching the soft woolen swaddling cloths that wrapped the child, feeling the steady, vibrant pulse of Liev within him. The noise of the overcrowded streets above had faded into complete insignificance. The empires of men, with all their cruel decrees and transient power, were merely dust upon the wind compared to the quiet, unassuming majesty unfolding in this humble stable. In the silence of the earth, heaven and earth had met. The light had pierced the deepest darkness, and the long, weary night of humanity had finally found its dawn. The amber flame of the small clay oil lamp flickered against the damp, ancient limestone of the cave, casting long, undulating shadows that danced gently across the uneven stone floor. Outside, the night air of Judea swept down from the rugged hills, carrying with it the cool, sharp scent of crushed wild thyme and dry desert dust. But within the shelter of the subterranean stable, the wind was nothing more than a distant, hollow murmur, unable to breach the profound sanctuary that had settled over the space. Mary sat upon a pallet of fresh, fragrant straw, her back resting against the cool, supporting curve of the rock wall. Every muscle in her body ached from the arduous journey across the hills of Nazareth and the frantic, hopeless search through the crowded, lamplit streets of Bethlehem. Yet, beneath that physical exhaustion, there lived a vast, unshakable ocean of peace. Her hands, slender and calloused from a lifetime of humble labor, curved gently around the small bundle resting against her chest. Wrapped tightly in simple strips of clean swaddling cloth, the newborn child breathed with a soft, rhythmic regularity that seemed to attune itself to the quiet pulse of the universe. Mary looked down at his tiny face, illuminated by the warm, golden glow of the oil lamp, marveling at the delicate perfection of his features. The weight of the divine calling, which had rested upon her young shoulders with such daunting gravity since the angel's visit in Galilee, had now transformed into something tender, intimate, and overwhelmingly real. She did not need to understand the grand, sweeping mechanics of the empires that ruled the world outside, nor the cruel decrees of Caesar that had driven them to this obscure corner of the earth. In this quiet cave, history had turned a corner, bypassing the marble palaces of Rome and the opulent courts of Jerusalem to take root in the dirt, the straw, and the quiet breath of ordinary human love. A few paces away, Joseph stood motionless, his broad, calloused hands resting lightly upon the rough wooden staff that had guided their steps through every perilous mile. For months, a quiet storm of anxiety had churned within his chest, a heavy, grinding worry over his inability to secure a proper roof for his young wife, a suffocating fear of failing in his duty as a protector, and a profound humility that made him feel utterly inadequate before the monumental task set before him. But as he looked upon Mary and the child, that storm dissolved into a vast, crystalline stillness. His chest rose and fell in a slow, deep rhythm, mirroring the steady breathing of the ox and the donkey tethered in the shadows of the alcove. The animals shifted slightly in the straw, their warm, earthy scent mingling with the sweet aroma of dry hay and the faint trace of frankincense that seemed to linger inexplicably in the air. Joseph let out a long, silent breath, feeling the tension drain from his shoulders. He was a carpenter, a man accustomed to working with rough timber, measuring twice, and building things that endured. He understood the quiet dignity of a well-joined joint, the patience required to plane a stubborn piece of wood until it fit true and square. And looking at the child, he understood that his role was not to comprehend the infinite mysteries of heaven, but to provide shelter, to stand guard against the dark, and to offer the steady, unyielding strength of a father's hands. He stepped forward, his sandals crunching softly against the scattered straw, and knelt beside Mary on the earthen floor. The movement was entirely unhurried, imbued with a deep, reverent grace. Mary looked up, her dark eyes meeting his with a silent, profound understanding born of shared trial and a miraculous grace that neither of them could fully articulate. Without a word, Joseph reached out, his large, weather-beaten fingers gently brushing the edge of the swaddling cloth. The contrast was striking, the immense, rugged strength of the working man alongside the fragile, luminous perfection of the newborn. Yet there was no hesitation in Joseph's touch, only a fierce, protective tenderness that anchored the entire scene in the stubborn reality of the physical world. He gently rested a hand over Mary's, sharing the weight of the child, anchoring the divine mystery within the solid, dependable earth of human devotion. The silence of the cave deepened, stretching outward until it seemed to encompass the entire Judean hillside. Outside, the stars burned with a brilliant, crystalline intensity in the black vault of the night sky, their ancient light wheeling across the heavens in a silent, cosmic choreography. And among them, leading the silent procession, hung the great star of the east, a radiant beacon of pure, concentrated light that seemed suspended directly above the limestone ridge of Bethlehem. Its beams did not flash or dazzle with harsh brilliance, rather, they poured down like liquid silver, bathing the humble mouth of the stable cave in a soft, ethereal halo that set it apart from the rest of the sleeping world. Far down the terraced slopes, beyond the sleepy outskirts of the town, that same light pierced through the cold darkness of the open fields, where a group of shepherds kept watch over their flocks by night. These were men of the earth, weathered by sun and wind, accustomed to the lonely vigils of the pasture, the sudden panic of scattered sheep, and the biting chill of the desert air. They were men whom the world deemed ordinary, whose names would never be recorded in the royal chronicles or the ledgers of tax collectors. To society, they were invisible, occupying the very bottom rung of the ladder, existing on the margins of civilization. Yet, as they sat around the dying embers of their brushwood fire, speaking in low, murmuring tones to pass the long hours, the darkness above them fractured into a breathtaking cascade of light. There was no sound of wind, no warning tremor in the earth, simply a sudden, luminous unfolding of the sky. The terror that gripped the shepherds was instantaneous and primal, a sudden, breathless constriction of the heart as the ordinary boundaries of the world melted away. But before fear could take root, the brilliant radiance softened into a melody of peace so profound that it bypassed the ears and sank directly into the soul. A heavenly messenger stood before them, clothed in the uncreated light of the divine presence, speaking words that banished the shadows not only from the hills, but from the deep, hidden recesses of human despair. "Do not be afraid," the voice resonated, clear and sweet as a mountain spring, echoing across the silent valleys. "For behold, I bring you good tidings of great joy which shall be to all people. For there is born to you this day, in the city of David, a Saviour, who is Christ the Lord." Before the shepherds could catch their breath, the single messenger was joined by a multitude of the heavenly host, a vast, shimmering choir of light that filled the night sky from horizon to horizon, praising God and singing of peace on earth and goodwill toward men. The air vibrated with a celestial harmony that made the stones of the hills hum in sympathetic resonance. It was a moment where heaven and earth completely dissolved their boundaries, where the infinite majesty of the Creator reached down to embrace the lowest and the loneliest of His creation. And then, as gently as it had arrived, the vision receded, leaving behind the vast, quiet expanse of the night sky, punctuated only by the brilliant, unwavering guide of the eastern star. The shepherds sat in stunned, breathless silence for a long moment, the crackling of the dying fire the only sound breaking the stillness. Then, one of them stood up, his gaze fixed upon the radiant star burning steadily above the town. There were no doubts among them, no cynical calculations, no hesitation. "Let us now go even unto Bethlehem," one of the older shepherds murmured, his voice thick with awe, "and see this thing which has come to pass, which the Lord has made known to us." With hurried, reverent steps, leaving their flocks to the quiet keeping of the hills, they began the ascent toward the town. They moved with a singular purpose, guided not by a map or a human decree, but by the irresistible pull of grace. Back within the stable cave, Mary and Joseph remained wrapped in their quiet sanctuary. The rhythmic breathing of the child continued, a steady, life-giving anchor in the vast stillness. Mary leaned her head back against the cool stone, closing her eyes for a brief moment to absorb the immense depth of the peace that surrounded them. She thought of the long road behind her, the uncertainty of the future, the shadows of a world that did not yet know what had happened within its borders. Yet none of those thoughts carried any fear. They were merely clouds passing across a vast, clear sky. Joseph shifted slightly, his instincts suddenly alerting him to a subtle change in the atmosphere outside. It was not a harsh sound, only the gentle crunch of sandals upon loose gravel, the muffled sound of hurried breathing, and low, hesitant voices approaching the mouth of the cave. He rose to his feet, picking up the oil lamp with one hand while instinctively placing himself between the entrance and the pallet where Mary sat today. His face was calm, his eyes steady, prepared to meet whatever the night might bring. The low leather curtain that hung across the mouth of the cave parted gently. The light of the oil lamp spilled out, catching the rough woolen cloaks of the men standing in the entrance. They were rugged, toil-worn, and breathing heavily from their climb, their faces etched with a mixture of profound awe and breathless wonder. They stood there in the shadows, hesitating on the threshold, suddenly acutely aware of their own humble station, dusty garments, and the rough smell of the fields they brought into this sacred space. Mary looked up, her expression one of gentle, welcoming warmth. There was no judgment in her eyes, no surprise at their sudden intrusion, only a deep, maternal recognition. She looked past their rough exteriors and saw the pure, searching hunger of their hearts. Joseph lowered his staff slightly, his protective posture softening as he read the expressions on the faces of the shepherds. He recognized men of labor, men who understood the weight of the earth, the demands of the seasons, and the quiet dignity of honest sweat. The oldest of the shepherds, a man with a beard frosted by years of wind and a face lined with weather, stepped forward. He knelt immediately upon the dusty earth of the cave floor, his rough hands trembling slightly as he removed his woolen cap. Behind him, the other shepherds followed suit, sinking quietly into the straw, their eyes instantly drawn to the small bundle cradled in Mary's arms. No one spoke for a long time. The only sound was the soft, contented sigh of an ox in the corner and the gentle, rhythmic breathing of the newborn child. The air within the cave seemed to thicken with a holy, palpable reverence, bridging the immense chasm between the divine and the mundane. Here, in the lowest place on earth, among the dirt, the manure, the straw, and the beasts, the shepherds of the hills knelt beside the King of the universe. There were no royal guards, no gold-plated thrones, no trumpets announcing the arrival of an earthly potentate. There was only the quiet radiance of a mother's face, the steadfast devotion of a working man, and the luminous, piercing light of a child who had come to rescue a weary world. The old shepherd raised his eyes, looking up at Mary with a tear glistening in the corner of his weathered eye. He did not need to ask questions. The peace that filled the cave answered every doubt, every hardship, and every sorrow he had ever known. "We saw the light," the shepherd whispered, his voice trembling with emotion, "and the messengers in the sky. They told us where to find you." Mary smiled, a tender, radiant expression that seemed to illuminate the dark corners of the cave even brighter than the oil lamp. She shifted the swaddling cloth slightly, offering them a clearer view of the child's face. "Come closer," she murmured softly, her voice like a soothing balm in the quiet night. "Do not be afraid." One by one, the shepherds crept forward on their knees, gazing down in absolute wonder at the infant. They saw the tiny, perfect fingers curled against the coarse cloth, the peaceful rise and fall of his chest, and the faint, golden halo of light that seemed to emanate from his very skin. They brought no grand treasures, no gold or expensive perfumes. They brought only themselves, their raw, unvarnished lives, their calloused hands, and their open, kneeling hearts. And in the eyes of the child, they found themselves completely known, completely accepted, and infinitely loved. Joseph watched them with a quiet, swelling pride. The loneliness that had pressed upon him during the long journey from Nazareth melted completely away. He was not alone. The world had not forgotten them, even if it had cast them out into a stable. Heaven had reached down and drawn the margins of the earth into the very center of its story. The night outside continued its slow, steady march toward dawn, but inside the stable cave, time seemed to stand completely still. The frantic pace of the Roman census, the harsh decrees of Herod, the bustling indifference of the Bethlehem innkeepers, all of it faded into absolute insignificance before the quiet majesty of this single moment. Mary gathered the child a little closer, feeling the steady, vibrant pulse of Liev within him. She looked around the humble cave, at the rough limestone walls, the flickering amber light, the faithful support of Joseph, and the kneeling figures of the shepherds bathed in a grace that transcended human understanding. She treasured all these things, turning them over in her heart, sealing them away in the quiet sanctuary of her soul. In the silence of the earth, heaven and earth had truly met. The light had pierced the deepest darkness, and the long, weary night of humanity had finally found its dawn. The child slept on, cradled in peace, while the star above kept its eternal watch over the sleeping hills, whispering a promise of redemption to a quiet, waiting world. Outside the subterranean warmth of the limestone cave, the vast expanse of the Judean night stretched toward the horizon in rolling waves of shadow and silver light. The chill of the desert air had deepened, carrying the sharp, clean scent of crushed wild thyme and dry earth across the terraces where the flocks rested. For generations, the shepherds of these hills had known every contour of the landscape by heart, navigating the treacherous ravines and rocky slopes entirely by the familiar constellations that wheeled slowly overhead. Yet tonight, the ordinary rhythm of the nocturnal watch had dissolved into a profound, breathless stillness that seemed to hold the entire earth in suspension. Eliam, the oldest of the watchmen, stood near the edge of the stone terrace, leaning heavily upon his weathered staff of polished olive wood. His joints ached with the accumulated dampness of countless nights spent under the open sky, and the deep lines etched into his face spoke of a lifetime spent weathering the harsh winds of the Judean wilderness. Beside him, a younger shepherd named Nathan shifted restlessly, his fingers nervously knotting the fringes of his woolen cloak, his gaze constantly darting toward the eastern horizon where the strange, brilliant star still burned with an unwavering, amber intensity. Just hours before, the quiet darkness of those very hills had been shattered by a terrifying glory that had driven them to their knees in the dust. Eliam could still feel the phantom echo of that celestial light vibrating within his bones, a sudden, blinding brilliance that had outshone the moon and filled the midnight sky with an army of towering presences. He remembered the primal surge of fear that had constricted his throat, the overwhelming sense of human unworthiness in the face of such unmediated majesty, and then, piercing through the terror, the resonant voice of the messenger proclaiming good news of great joy for all people. To Eliam and his companions, social outcasts who spent their lives on the margins of society among the dust and the sheep, the message had carried a weight that defied all earthly logic. The heavens had not spoken to the high priests in their gilded courts in Jerusalem, nor to the Roman prefects within their marble fortresses. Instead, the divine proclamation had broken first upon the ears of humble watchmen guarding ordinary flocks. In that miraculous moment, the dignity of human lowliness had been exalted, proving that no life was too obscure or too forgotten to escape the notice of heaven. Now, the brilliant angelic host had vanished back into the unseen realms, leaving behind a silence so deep and profound that it felt almost sacred. The flock had long since settled, their rhythmic, comforting breathing echoing softly against the stone walls of the surrounding enclosures, chewing their cud in total tranquility. The raw terror of the encounter had gradually melted away, replaced by an overwhelming, awe-inspiring wonder that left the shepherd scarcely daring to draw breath. Eliam turned his gaze from the star toward his companions, his voice low and steady as it broke the quiet of the night. There was no need for prolonged debate or hesitation, for the instruction given by the heavenly messenger had been as clear as the light guiding them from above. They were commanded to go, to seek out a newborn child wrapped in swaddling cloths and lying in a feeding trough within the nearby town of Bethlehem. With a renewed vigor that seemed to momentarily banish the heavy fatigue of his aging limbs, Eliam led the small band of shepherds down the winding, ancient pathways that lead toward the sleeping settlement. The dusty track was bordered by terraced olive groves whose gnarled branches cast twisting, silvery shadows across the ground. Every step forward felt like a journey across the threshold of ordinary history into something infinitely vast and transformative. The convergence of heaven and earth, whispered about by the ancient prophets through centuries of waiting and suffering, was no longer a distant theological abstraction, it was a tangible reality waiting for them in the dark. As they descended into the outskirts of Bethlehem, the town itself lay shrouded in heavy slumber, its crowded houses huddled together beneath the watchful eye of the Judean hills. The census had swelled the population to its bursting point days earlier, filling every available guest room and courtyard with travelers, merchants, and families returning to their ancestral homes. Yet through the narrow, lamp-lit streets, a strange, restorative quiet reigned, undisturbed by the usual clamor of daily commerce. Guided instinctively by the brilliant, guiding radiance that hovered directly above the southern edge of the village, the shepherds navigated the winding alleys until they reached the rugged limestone outcroppings where the dwelling caves were carved into the hillside. These subterranean spaces, often used to shelter livestock during the bitter winter months, were humble and unpretentious, far removed from the pomp and circumstance that usually attended the birth of a king. Here, divine providence was working through the quiet, ordinary machinery of historical events, cloaking the miraculous in the garments of absolute simplicity. Stopping before the shadowed entrance of a low-lying stable cave, Eliam raised a hand to signal his companions to halt. From within the dark interior came the gentle, rhythmic sounds of cattle and sheep shifting in their sleep, accompanied by the unmistakable warmth of animal breath mingling with the cool night air. Faintly, casting long, dancing amber shadows against the damp limestone walls, the warm glow of a small clay oil lamp illuminated the scene from deep within the recess. With cautious, reverent steps, the old shepherd ducked beneath the low stone lintel and entered the sanctuary of the stable. The sharp, sweet scent of dry hay and crushed straw rose to meet him, blending with the earthy aromas of the livestock and the faint, lingering traces of frankincense and myrrh brought by earlier, unseen travelers. Time seemed to slow to a crawl as Eliam's eyes adjusted to the dim, golden light, revealing a sight that instantly quieted the remaining doubts within his soul. There, resting upon a bed of clean straw inside a wooden manger, lay the child. He was wrapped tightly in simple swaddling cloths, just as the heavenly messenger had foretold, his tiny chest rising and falling with the fragile, steady rhythm of newborn life. Kneeling beside the wooden trough was Mary, her face pale with exhaustion yet illuminated from within by a gentle, transcendent peace, while Joseph stood close by, his strong, calloused hands resting protectively against the stone wall as he gazed down at the infant with a look of quiet, protective devotion. The shepherd stopped just inside the entrance, overwhelmed by a sudden, humbling wave of emotion. These hardened men of the hills, accustomed to the rough companionship of animals and the solitary vigil of the wilderness, felt the profound weight of the moment pressing gently upon their spirits. The light that had pierced the deepest darkness of the cosmos was now present right before them, housed within the fragile, beating heart of a human child. In this lowliest of places, surrounded by the quiet beasts of the field, the long, weary night of humanity had finally found its dawn. Eliam sank slowly to his knees in the dust, the rough fabric of his woolen tunic brushing against the straw-strewn floor. Behind him, Nathan and the other shepherds followed suit, lowering their heads in deep, unreserved reverence. There was no need for elaborate speeches or formal greetings. The silent communion of their hearts spoke more eloquently than any words could manage. They were witnesses to a mystery that defied human comprehension, yet invited universal inclusion, stretching from the humble keepers of sheep on the hillsides to the wise sages gazing at the stars in distant lands. After a long moment of breathless silence, Mary lifted her eyes from the child and looked toward the men kneeling at the edge of the light. There was no fear in her gaze, only a deep, welcoming warmth that acknowledged their presence as part of the unfolding tapestry of grace. Encouraged by her gentle expression, Eliam found his voice, speaking in a low, trembling whisper that blended harmoniously with the soft breathing of the animals. He recounted the terrors of the midnight sky, the blinding glory of the angelic host, and the precise instructions that had driven them across the rocky terraces to this humble refuge. As he spoke, Joseph listened intently, his expression filled with quiet wonder, while Mary absorbed every detail, turning the words over in the sanctuary of her heart, weaving them together with the memories of the angel's visitations and the quiet promises whispered long ago. When Eliam finished speaking, the stable lapsed once more into a sacred, unbroken quiet. The infant stirred slightly in his sleep, letting out a soft, contented sigh that seemed to echo through the very foundations of the earth, sealing the promise of redemption for a waiting world. The shepherds remained for a long time in that gentle radiance, drinking in the peace that transcended all understanding, their souls anchored by the quiet assurance of what they had seen and heard. When at last they rose to depart, stepping backward out of the cavern with quiet reverence, their lives had been irrevocably altered. They emerged once more beneath the starlit canopy of the Judean sky, but the darkness no longer felt empty or threatening, it was filled with the reverberating echo of divine love. As they made their way back up the winding paths toward their waiting flocks, spreading the news of the wondrous things they had witnessed to everyone they met along the way, the star above continued its steady, eternal watch, guiding the sleeping world toward a brighter, unending morning. The night air on the limestone slopes of Bethlehem grew still, carrying the crisp, mineral chill of the desert floor as the midnight hour deepened. Far down in the hollow of the hill, shielded by the rough-hewn mouth of the subterranean stable cave, the lanterns burned low, their golden flames dancing softly against the ancient, soot-darkened walls. The commotion of the crowded village above, the distant shouting of merchants, the braying of pack animals, the heavy thud of sandals on packed dirt, had long since faded into a distant, muffled hum, swallowed by the vast, enveloping quiet of the Judean wilderness. Inside the shelter of the cave, the atmosphere was thick with the rich, comforting scent of dry straw, sun-baked earth, and the sweet, warm breath of resting livestock. A lone clay oil lamp sat upon a jagged ledge of rock, casting long, amber shadows that swayed gently with the quiet rhythm of the night. Mary sat upon a pallet of woven wool and freshly gathered hay, her back resting against the cool, reassuring curve of the limestone wall. A profound, unearthly stillness rested upon her shoulders, replacing the arduous physical exhaustion of the journey with a quiet, luminous grace. Her hands, calloused from the daily labor of Nazareth yet remarkably steady, gently adjusted the folds of coarse linen that wrapped the small, sleeping form resting against her heart. The infant rose and fell with each soft, even breath, anchored safely in the warmth of the world he had entered with such startling humility. Across the earthen floor, Joseph leaned against a wooden pillar that helped support the low-ceilinged roof of the stable. His broad shoulders, usually tense with the perpetual weight of worry and the demanding labor of his trade, were finally allowed a moment of reprieve. He looked down at his rough, sawdust-stained hands, marveling at how gently they had managed to cradle the fragile child earlier that evening. A slow, deep breath lifted his chest as he gazed across the warm space toward Mary and the child, a quiet tide of profound protectiveness washing away the remnants of anxiety that had dogged their long steps from Galilee. They did not speak. Words were entirely unnecessary in a space so thoroughly filled with the quiet resonance of grace. The mystery of the universe had not chosen a marble hall or a royal palace, it had descended into the dirt and the quiet, breathing dark, wrapping itself in the most ordinary garments of humanity. Outside, the crunch of sand and loose limestone signaled the approach of hurried footsteps. Joseph instinctively shifted, his hand resting lightly on the wooden staff leaning against the wall, his eyes turning sharply toward the dark, arched opening of the cave. But the tension in his posture melted away almost as quickly as it had arisen. There was no menace in the approach, only a breathless, stumbling urgency. A moment later, the silhouette of a weathered man filled the doorway, his silhouette sharply limned by the pale starlight outside. It was Eliam. The aging shepherd paused on the threshold, his chest heaving slightly from the rapid climb up the rocky path, his weathered face illuminated by the warm, amber glow of the oil lamp. Behind him, other shapes lingered in the shadows, fellow shepherds who had left their flocks on the hillside, their eyes wide with an astonishing, restless wonder. Eliam looked into the dim interior of the stable, his gaze sweeping past Joseph and coming to rest upon Mary and the child cradled in her arms. The rough, hardened lines of his face, carved by decades of wind, sun, and lonely nocturnal vigils, softened entirely. Without a word, the old shepherd lowered himself slowly to his knees, his calloused hands pressing flat against the dusty earth as if touching holy ground. Mary looked down at the kneeling man with a gaze of infinite tenderness. She did not shrink back from the intrusion, nor did she clutch the child closer in fear. Instead, she tilted her head in a silent gesture of welcome, holding open the space for these humble witnesses of the night. Eliam raised his head, his voice trembling with a mixture of awe and residual disbelief. He spoke in a low, reverent whisper that seemed to blend seamlessly with the soft rustle of the straw and the deep, rhythmic breathing of the cattle nearby. "We were out on the hills," Eliam murmured, his eyes glistening in the flickering lamplight as he recalled the terrifying, glorious rupture of the night sky. "Watching the sheep in the dark." The silence was absolute, just as it always is at that hour. And then, the night simply tore open. A light brighter than the noon sun surrounded us, and the air filled with a sound like rushing water and singing harps. We fell to the earth, terrified for our very lives, thinking the final judgment had come upon us. He paused, swallowing hard, his chest rising and falling as the memory washed over him anew. But the voice that came through the light was not one of wrath. Eliam continued, his gaze drifting once more to the tiny infant resting against Mary's chest. It was a voice of overwhelming peace. "Do not be afraid," it said to us. "For unto you is born this day in the city of David a Saviour, who is Christ the Lord. And the sign, the miraculous sign given to us so we might know where to find the Creator of the stars, was this: we would find a baby, wrapped in swaddling cloths, lying not in silk or gold, but in a manger, among the beasts of the field." Joseph took a quiet step forward, his boots making a soft crunching sound against the straw. He placed a steady, reassuring hand on Eliam's trembling shoulder, feeling the profound tremor that still lingered in the old man's bones. "You found your way through the dark," Joseph said softly, his voice a deep, anchoring anchor in the small cavern. "We ran," Eliam whispered, a faint, wondrous smile breaking across his weathered features. "We left the sheep on the hillside because nothing on this earth mattered more than seeing if the words of the messenger were true. And here you are, in the most unlikely of places. The King of the universe, resting in the dust." The other shepherds stepped cautiously across the threshold, their heavy wool cloaks brushing against the damp limestone walls. One by one, they knelt upon the earthen floor, their rough, calloused hands clasped together in silent adoration. They brought no lavish gifts of gold or frankincense. They carried only the quiet devotion of men who knew what it meant to leave on the margins, to labor in the dark, and to long for the dawn. Mary observed them all with a quiet, fathomless intensity. Every word Eliam spoke, every detail of the heavenly encounter on the hills, she gathered up like precious stones, turning them over and over within the sanctuary of her heart. She treasured them, weaving the miraculous threads of the night into the tapestry of her quiet contemplation. She knew that the path ahead would be fraught with peril, that the shadows of the world would eventually seek to snuff out the fragile flame burning so brightly before her. But looking at the humble shepherds bowed in the straw, she felt an unshakable assurance that the dawn had truly broken, and no darkness could ever fully overcome it. The hours drifted onward, measured only by the slow arc of the star of the east outside the cave's mouth, casting its steady, silver beam down upon the stable roof like a quiet sentinel. The intensity of the initial arrival gently softened into a profound, restorative stillness. The shepherds eventually rose, their spirits buoyed by an interior peace that defied the cold and the roughness of their daily lives. With quiet reverence, they bowed once more to Mary and Joseph before turning back toward the door, their steps lighter than they had been in years. They returned to their flocks eager to tell everyone they met along the way of the wondrous things their eyes had seen, transforming the quiet hills into pathways of living testimony. Inside the stable, the embers in the small clay lamp burned down to glowing coals of deep, rich crimson. Joseph gently guided Mary back down against the soft pallet of hay and wool, arranging her cloak so that she might find rest at last. He settled himself nearby, keeping a watchful, tender eye on the two lives that had become the entire world to him. The exhaustion that pulled at his limbs felt entirely different now, not the crushing weight of a burdened exile, but the deep, satisfying tiredness of a laborer who had laid the foundation of something eternal. Mary closed her eyes, her breathing falling into a slow, harmonious rhythm with the infant resting beside her. The stable cave wrapped its ancient, stony arms around them, offering a sanctuary of profound peace against the vast, sleeping expanse of the Judean night. Heaven and earth had met in the most humble of silences, and the world, though it slept on unaware, was forever changed. Far across the sleeping ridges of the Judean wilderness, where the limestone crags rose like pale, silent sentinels against the violet expanse of the night, a different kind of vigil was drawing to its long-awaited close. High upon a plateau overlooking the ancient trade routes, Melchior sat beside a dying ember of tamarisk wood. He was an old man now, his silver beard braided in the tradition of the Eastern scholars, his fingers calloused not from the handle of a sword, but from the turning of celestial charts and the smooth, polished brass of his astrolabe. For decades, through the bitter, frost-bitten nights of the Persian high plateau and the scorching, wind-scoured expanses of the Syrian desert, he had followed a silent promise written in fire across the vault of heaven. Beside him, two younger companions, scholars who had shared the burden of the camels, the scarcity of desert wells, and the mocking skepticism of palace courts, slept deeply, their breathing steady against the cool midnight air. But Melchior could not sleep. His gaze remained fixed upon the southern horizon, where a single, extraordinarily luminous star hung low and steadfast above the huddled, slumbering silhouette of Bethlehem. It was not merely its brightness that commanded his soul, though it burned with a pure, diamond-like intensity that shamed the surrounding constellations, it was its stillness. For months, the star had moved before them like a silent herald, a compass of pure light cutting through the trackless dark. Now, it hovered directly above the limestone hills, its rays casting a soft, celestial silver upon the terraced olive groves and the stone-walled sheepfolds below. Melchior reached out with a trembling, weather-worn hand, touching the wooden flank of his resting camel, reassuring the beast with a low, familiar murmur. The journey was over. The calculations of a lifetime, the ancient scrolls deciphered by the dim light of oil lamps in the great library of Babylon, the whispers of prophets dead for centuries, all of it had converged upon this quiet, unassuming fold of the earth. He rose slowly, his joints aching with the profound fatigue of a traveler who had crossed empires, yet his heart felt as light as a boy's. Awakening his companions with a gentle word, they loaded the final measures of frankincense and myrrh, securing the heavy wooden chests upon the pack saddles. Without a word of complaint, guided only by that peerless beacon in the south, they descended the winding track toward the sleeping town. At that very hour, miles away within the heavily fortified citadel of Jerusalem, another man stared out into the dark with eyes hardened by suspicion and sleepless dread. King Herod the Great paced the mosaic floors of his private chamber, his royal purple robe dragging slightly behind him. The palace was silent, save for the faint, rhythmic clank of armor from the guards stationed in the marble corridors, yet Herod's mind was a tempest of jagged shadows. He was an old lion whose teeth had grown dull, a monarch surrounded by luxury yet utterly impoverished of trust. Every shadow in the colonnade looked like an assassin, every whisper among the courtiers sounded like treason. Days earlier, foreign travelers, men of dignified bearing and strange, exotic speech, had ridden into Jerusalem, asking open questions about a newborn king of the Jews whose star they had seen in the east. The very phrase had struck Herod like a poisoned dagger. A king. He had spent decades forging his throne out of alliances, blood, and Roman favor, ruthlessly crushing any whisper of domestic rebellion. The thought that a rival, born of humble stock in some obscure corner of his realm, might inherit the loyalty of the people was an intolerable poison. He had summoned the chief priests and scribes in the dead of night, demanding to know where the ancient writings said the Messiah was to be born. With trembling voices, they had cited the ancient words of Micah, "And you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah, for from you shall come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel." Herod had dismissed them with a cold, dismissing wave of his jeweled hand, but the seed of terror had already taken root. He had secretly called the Magi to his chambers, interrogating them closely about the exact time the star had appeared, masking his murderous intent behind a veneer of polite diplomacy. "Go and search carefully for the child," he had told them with a thin, brittle smile, "and when you have found him, bring me word, that I too may come and worship him." Now, alone in the dark of his palace, Herod clenched his fists until his fingernails bit into his palms. He did not want to worship, he wanted to extinguish. He trusted no one, not his sons, not his wives, not the Roman Senate, and certainly not a phantom king heralded by wandering astronomers. He would wait for the Magi to return. And if they did not return, his guards would scour every stone of Judea until the threat was unmade. Yet, for all his armies, his gold, and his paranoid vigilance, the king in Jerusalem was entirely blind to the reality unfolding beneath the stars. Power does not always reside where the banners fly. Down in Bethlehem, the streets were wrapped in a deep, undisturbed slumber. The census takers had departed or retired to their rented rooms, and the tavern keeper's courtyard was quiet, the noise of the day replaced by the chirping of crickets and the occasional shifting of livestock. Melchior and his companions guided their beasts through the quiet lanes, their soft footfalls muffled by the dusty earth. As they reached the lower outskirts of the village, near the terraced limestone slopes where the shepherds kept their flocks, the star above them seemed to pause, casting a direct, luminous beam down toward the mouth of a low, jagged cave opening in the hillside. The Magi drew rein. They dismounted stiffly, their legs weak from the long ride, and looked at one another with quiet, reverent awe. Here? Not a palace of cedar and stone? Not a fortress with gleaming gates? Leaving the camels in the care of their servants, Melchior and his two companions approached the cave on foot. The cool night air carried the earthy, comforting scent of dry straw, sweet hay, and the gentle musk of resting animals. A faint amber glow spilled outward from the interior, painting the rough stones at the entrance with a warm, welcoming light. They stepped quietly beneath the low stone lintel, ducking their heads to enter the subterranean sanctuary. The transition from the vast, starlit wilderness to the intimate enclosure of the stable was profound. The air inside was still and warm, naturally insulated by the living rock of the earth. In the center of the cave, beside the wooden manger filled with fresh grass, Mary sat resting against a bundle of clean straw, her face illuminated by the flickering, golden light of a small clay oil lamp. Joseph stood near her, his strong, calloused hands resting gently on a wooden post, his expression a mixture of profound exhaustion and quiet, unshakable wonder. And there, wrapped simply in swaddling cloths, lay the child. Melchior felt his breath catch in his throat. In all his years of studying the vast machinery of the cosmos, the majestic dance of planets, the fiery arcs of comets, the infinite, terrifying beauty of the night sky, he had never encountered a majesty so quiet, so disarming, so utterly devoid of pride. This was not the arrogant power of Herod, backed by steel and stone. This was the power of a seed resting in the dark earth, holding within its fragile shell the green promise of an entire spring. Without a word, the elderly scholar sank slowly to his knees upon the uneven, straw-strewn floor of the cave. His companions followed suit, bowing their heads until their foreheads nearly touched the cool earth. The weight of their long journey, the skepticism of the world they had left behind, the cold political winds blowing from Jerusalem, all of it vanished, dissolved into the absolute peace of this humble grotto. In the quiet warmth of the stable, the infant stirred slightly, drawing a soft, sweet breath. A cow shifted in the shadows, its breath pluming like white mist in the amber air, and a sheep gave a low, contented bleat from the far corner, as if acknowledging a shepherd far greater than any they had ever known. With trembling reverence, Melchior opened the heavy lid of the primary chest he had carried across continents. Inside, resting on a bed of dark purple velvet, lay lumps of pure frankincense, harvested from the distant trees of southern Arabia. He lifted the fragrant resin and placed it gently near the edge of the manger, the sweet, earthy aroma immediately rising to fill the cave, mingling with the scent of hay and dust. His companion stepped forward next, placing a chest of bitter, precious myrrh upon the floor, a substance used for anointing, speaking silently of a life that would touch the deepest sorrows of humanity. And the third presented a gleaming wedge of pure gold, the tribute of kings, offered not to a ruler of earthly domains, but to a sovereign whose kingdom was built upon love and sacrifice. Mary looked down at the gifts, then raised her eyes to meet the wise, tear-filled gaze of the elderly magus. She did not speak, for words were unnecessary here. A quiet nod passed between them, an unspoken acknowledgement that the ancient threads of history had woven themselves together in this obscure stable, witnessed only by beasts, humble shepherds who had come and gone into the night, and foreign sages from the edge of the known world. Outside, high above the Judean hills, the star continued its steady, brilliant vigil, anchoring the heavens to the earth. The night deepened, wrapping its dark, velvet wings around Bethlehem, around the restless palace in Jerusalem, and around the quiet cave where heaven had taken up residence among the lowly. The world outside slept on, locked in its familiar cycles of power and fear, unaware that a new dawn had already begun beneath the earth, silent and unstoppable as the turning of the stars. The first pale streak of silver light crept over the crest of the eastern hills, sliding slowly down the rugged limestone slopes of Bethlehem to touch the quiet entrance of the cave. Inside that subterranean shelter, the cool morning air carried the faint, sweet scent of dry barley straw, sun-warmed earth, and the gentle, rhythmic breathing of the animals resting in the shadows. The small clay oil lamp on a rocky ledge had burned low, its amber flame flickering in a soft draught, yielding gracefully to the broader, purer daylight of a new morning. Mary sat upon a folded woolen cloak near the manger, her shoulders wrapped in a dark blue shawl, her hands resting softly over the folds of linen that swaddled her child. She watched the infant's steady, shallow breaths, marveling at the quiet miracle of life that had chosen her as its dwelling place. All the weariness of the long, dusty road from Nazareth, all the uncertainty of the crowded inn, and all the sharp pangs of anxiety that had accompanied their arrival dissolved completely in the profound stillness of the dawn. Her heart was a deep well of peace, untroubled by the vastness of the mystery she held, content simply to watch the soft rise and fall of the small chest against her arm. A few paces away, Joseph sat on an upturned wooden crate, his calloused hands resting on his knees. He looked down at his palms, darkened by years of working heavy timber, and then slowly raised his gaze to the child. A slow, profound wonder smoothed the lines of worry from his weathered brow. He had spent the long hours of the night standing watch at the low wooden door, listening to the murmurs of the wind and the distant, sleeping town, ready to protect his fragile family from any intrusion. But the night had brought no threats, only shepherds, and songs from the sky, and a stillness so deep it felt as though the whole of creation was holding its breath. He let out a long, quiet sigh, his chest expanding with a sense of resolute purpose and a deep, abiding rest he had never known before. Outside, the narrow pathways of Bethlehem began to stir with the early sounds of a waking village. Wooden shutters creaked open, clay jars clinked against stone as women walked down to the communal well, and the low murmur of voices drifted through the crisp morning air. Yet none of those early risers, hurrying to their daily labors, knew that the center of the universe had shifted during the dark hours, settling quietly into the limestone hollow beneath the sheepfolds. Eliam stood near the mouth of the cave, his weather-beaten face bathed in the cool light of dawn. The older shepherd held his wooden crook in one hand, his thumb tracing the smooth, polished wood where decades of holding sheep had worn it bright. Beside him stood his son and two companions from the hill flocks, their eyes wide with a mixture of lingering awe and the quiet exhaustion that follows a night of profound revelation. They had spent the remaining hours of darkness kneeling in the straw, speaking in whispers of the light that had split the midnight sky and the voice of the messenger that had bade them not to fear. Now, as the morning sun chased the purple shadows from the valley, Eliam stepped forward once more into the warm interior of the cave. He moved with a reverence usually reserved for the holy places in Jerusalem, his heavy sandals scraping softly against the stone floor. Mary looked up, her dark eyes meeting the old shepherd's gaze with calm, welcoming warmth. Eliam bowed his head low, his gnarled hands trembling slightly as he reached into his leather pouch. He withdrew a small, polished wooden whistle, one he had carved himself from a fallen olive branch during long afternoons watching the sheep graze upon the stony hillsides. It was his most treasured possession, simple and plain, yet fashioned with care. "We brought no gold," Eliam said, his voice husky with emotion, the rough edges of a lifetime outdoors softened by a deep, interior tenderness. "We brought only what the hills gave us, and our own two ears that heard the song of heaven." May this small thing remind him, when he grows to walk these fields, that the lowest places are never forgotten. He laid the wooden whistle gently on the edge of the manger, right beside the sleeping child's tiny hand. Mary leaned forward and touched the shepherd's rough, sun-darkened arm with her fingertips. "He will walk these fields," Mary whispered, her voice like water flowing over smooth stones. "And he will know the sound of the hills." "Thank you for coming, Eliam. Your watch has only just begun." The shepherds lingered for a few moments longer, drinking in the quiet peace of the place before turning reluctantly toward the bright light of the morning. They walked back up the path toward their flocks, their steps lighter than they had been in years, carrying within their chests a secret joy that made the ordinary world look entirely new. The sheep bleated softly as the men returned, but the shepherds barely noticed the daily routine, their minds still echoing with the harmony of angels and the sight of a king wrapped in common linen. As the morning advanced and the sun climbed higher into the azure sky, casting warm gold across the stone walls of Bethlehem, a new sound broke the tranquility of the approach. It was not the shuffling of local villagers or the bleating of hillside flocks, but the slow, measured tread of heavy-footed beasts and the soft chiming of small brass bells. Joseph turned from his place near the door, shading his eyes against the brilliant morning glare. Coming up the winding limestone track was a small, extraordinary procession. 3 tall, richly caparisoned camels led the way, their coats groomed and adorned with woven blankets of crimson and gold thread. Walking beside them were attendants in foreign garb, but all eyes were drawn to the rider of the leading beast, an elderly man with a long, silver beard, wearing robes of deep indigo silk that shimmered faintly in the desert sun. Melchior, the scholar from the east, dismounted with the aid of a younger attendant. His joints ached from weeks of riding across parched wilderness and rocky plateaus, but his face was radiant. For decades, his eyes had scanned the nocturnal skies from high stone observatories, charting the slow, majestic dance of constellations, searching for the single sign that would herald a new era for mankind. He had spent his youth in dusty libraries and his middle years mapping the paths of comets, and now, in the twilight of his life, his long journey had found its destination. The star that had guided them across rivers and mountain passes had finally come to rest directly above this unassuming ridge in Bethlehem. Melchior paused at the threshold of the cave. He bent his tall, lean frame to step through the low entrance, leaving the brilliant glare of the Judean sun behind as he entered the cool, amber shadows of the stable. The rich scent of exotic spices, frankincense, and myrrh drifted from the leather bags carried by his attendants, mingling with the earthy smells of the cave and creating an atmosphere that felt suspended between heaven and earth. Mary looked up, her expression serene and untroubled by the sudden arrival of foreign royalty in their humble sanctuary. She held the child securely against her breast, her eyes steady and welcoming. Melchior did not speak. He crossed the uneven stone floor, his silk robes whispering against the dry straw, and sank slowly to his knees. The long journey, the skepticism of fellow scholars back in the East, the bitter winds of the desert nights, and the vast expanse of time he had devoted to his quest all vanished into the profound stillness of the moment. Here, in a cave meant for beasts, was the answer to every question he had ever asked. He reached into the folds of his garment and drew forth a small, heavy casket of beaten gold, chased with delicate patterns of leaves and stars. With trembling fingers, he set the box upon the floor at the feet of the manger. "We saw his star in the east," Melchior spoke at last, his voice rich and deep, carrying the cadence of distant lands and ancient languages. "And we have come to worship him. The wisdom of the nations bows before this child, for the dark night has broken, and the true light has dawned upon the earth." Joseph stepped forward, placing a steady hand upon the old scholar's shoulder in a gesture of shared humanity that bridged empires and humble carpenters alike. Melchior looked up, meeting Joseph's gaze, and in that silent exchange, the carpenter understood that his son belonged not just to Mary and to him, but to the whole wide world, to the lonely shepherds on the hills and to the learned sages from across the sands. Melchior's attendants stepped forward in turn, placing small alabaster jars of incense and fragrant resin near the golden chest. The sweet, heavy scent of frankincense drifted upward, filling the dark recesses of the cave with a sacred aroma that chased away the last lingering dampness of the night. The light from the oil lamp caught the polished surface of the gold and the smooth curve of the alabaster, casting gentle, dancing reflections against the rough limestone walls. For a long time, no one spoke. The cave was filled only with the soft breathing of the child, the occasional rustle of straw as an ox shifted its weight in the stall behind them, and the quiet, rhythmic ticking of time itself slowing down to match the peace of the moment. Outside, the world went about its business. Merchants shouted in the marketplace, children chased one another down the dusty lanes, and Roman guards marched with measured, heavy steps along the stone fortifications of the town. Life in Judea remained difficult, uncertain, and bound by the heavy chains of power and survival. Yet beneath the surface of the world, something fundamental had shifted. A seed of quiet light had been planted in the dark earth of human history, and nothing, neither empires, nor time nor fear, could ever uproot it. Melchior rose slowly, bowing once more to Mary and the child before turning to retrace his steps toward the light of the entrance. His attendants followed him out into the bright morning air, leaving the cave to its quiet solitude. The foreign camels turned their long necks, their bells chiming softly as the procession began to make its way down the hillside, their mission fulfilled, their hearts brimming with an inexplicable, lasting peace. Inside the stable, Mary looked down at her son. The infant's eyes flickered open, dark and clear, reflecting the amber glow of the little lamp and the wide, open sky outside. She smiled, a soft, radiant expression that held all the grace of the universe within its quiet curves. She drew the woolen blanket a fraction higher around his shoulders, tucking him in against the cool morning draft that still whispered through the cracks of the stone. Joseph walked back to his post near the wooden door, leaning his shoulder against the sturdy limestone frame. He looked out across the terraced hills of Bethlehem, where the olive trees lifted their silver-green leaves to the warming sun, and the dry grass shimmered in the morning light. The wind died down completely, leaving the hills in a state of absolute, unbroken tranquility. The sky above was a vast, clear expanse of purest blue, stretching out without a single cloud, holding the memory of the night and the promise of the day in perfect harmony. The tension of the journey, the anxiety of the crowded streets, the coldness of the night, and the weight of the unknown future all dissolved like morning mist beneath the rising sun. There was nothing left to fear, and nothing more to seek. The long night of waiting had ended, and the world rested at last in the quiet dawn, cradled by a love that had come down to dwell among the lowly, silent and unstoppable as the turning of the stars. The morning sun climbed higher above the Judean hills, casting a warm, golden radiance across the terraced slopes where ancient olive trees traced gnarled patterns against the pale limestone. Down in the narrow, winding lanes of Bethlehem, the bustling commotion of the census began to stir once more, as merchants unfolded their canvas stalls, donkeys brayed against their tethers, and the low murmur of countless travelers filled the dusty air. Yet, within the quiet seclusion of the limestone cave that served as a stable, a profound and unbothered stillness remained untouched by the waking world outside. Mary sat upon a bed of fresh, sweet-smelling straw, her shoulders relaxed against the cool rock wall, watching the steady, peaceful rise and fall of the small bundle resting in her arms. The infant was wrapped securely in the clean, white swaddling cloths Joseph had so carefully prepared, his tiny hands resting softly beneath his chin, completely unaware of the vast, expectant universe that now revolved around his quiet breathing. The golden light of morning slanted through the cavern's low entrance, catching the drifting motes of dust and casting a gentle halo across the mother's tired yet radiant face, framing a moment of pure, unhurried grace. Joseph stood nearby, resting his calloused hand upon a wooden roof beam, his gaze shifting from the sleeping child to Mary with a quiet reverence that seemed to anchor the entire space. He had spent the remaining hours of the night tending to the small charcoal brazier and ensuring the animals, the patient ox and the gentle donkey, had their fill of fodder, moving with a practiced, deliberate care so as not to disturb the sanctity of the dawn. Now, as the morning air grew mild, he knelt softly beside them, offering a small wooden cup of water to Mary, his movements unhurried and steady. "The town is waking," Joseph whispered, his voice low and rich with a gentle warmth, blending seamlessly into the quiet atmosphere of the shelter. "The crowds are beginning to gather near the well at the center of the square, and the Roman guards have taken their posts by the outer gate." Mary took the cup with a soft smile, her fingers brushing lightly against his rough, weathered palm, acknowledging the practical realities of the world outside without letting them intrude upon the sanctuary of the stable. "Let them bustle, Joseph," she murmured softly, her voice like the rustling of dry leaves in a gentle breeze. "Here, time moves differently. It is as though the whole of creation has paused just long enough for us to draw breath." Outside the cave, the rolling hills stretched out toward the distant wilderness of Judea, where Eliam the shepherd stood upon a rocky outcrop, leaning heavily upon his wooden crook as he surveyed the vast expanse of the pastures. The night watch had ended, leaving behind a strange, lingering resonance in the hearts of all the men who had beheld the wondrous light in the heavens. Although the brilliant star had long since faded into the brightening blue of day, its impression remained etched upon their minds like an unshakable truth, coloring every shadow and every stone with a deeper significance. Eliam turned his gaze toward the clustered rooftops of Bethlehem nestled in the valley below, feeling an inexplicable pull drawing his thoughts back toward the humble outskirts of the town. His fellow shepherds were busy gathering their gear, murmuring among themselves about the strange visions and the chorus of voices that had seemed to fill the very fabric of the night, trying to rationalize the miraculous with the ordinary demands of their daily labor. But Eliam knew that nothing would ever be ordinary again, for the silence of the hills had spoken a promise that demanded an answer. Miles away, far across the parched expanse of the Arabian desert, a very different journey was drawing toward its long-anticipated conclusion, led by the silent, relentless movement of the celestial guide. Prince Melchior urged his weary camel forward, the animal's padded feet moving with rhythmic grace across the shifting sands, while his companions, Caspar and Balthazar, rode close behind, their robes dusty from weeks of travel beneath an unforgiving sun. They had crossed vast empires, navigated treacherous mountain passes, and endured the biting cold of desert nights, all driven by the ancient prophecies preserved in the star charts of Babylon and Persia. Melchior adjusted the heavy linen scarf that protected his face from the dry wind, his dark eyes fixed upon the western horizon where the faint, residual glimmer of the great star still seemed to anchor their course. Unlike the common travelers who sought only lodging, or the Roman administrators who sought control, the Magi sought a king whose dominion was not forged in iron or sustained by taxation, but one whose birth had been written in the eternal language of the cosmos. Every league they had crossed had stripped away another layer of pride, leaving them humble seekers at the threshold of a great and hidden mystery. Back within the limestone stable, the morning wore on with a slow, restorative rhythm, allowing Mary to rest while Joseph busied himself with small, necessary tasks, fashioning a makeshift latch for the low wooden gate to keep the wandering sheep from the surrounding lanes at bay. The air inside was pleasantly cool, smelling faintly of clover, earth, and the warm, sweet breath of the livestock, creating an enclosure that felt entirely divorced from the noise and pretense of the Herodian world just beyond the threshold. In his palace at Jerusalem, King Herod the Great paced restlessly across the polished marble mosaic of his private chamber, his mind consumed by dark suspicions and the restless paranoia that defined his twilight years. Reports of foreign travelers inquiring after a newborn king had unsettled the aging monarch, stirring ancient fears of usurpation and rebellion that haunted his sleepless nights. He had already summoned his chief priests and scribes, demanding to know where the prophets had foretold the birth of the Messiah, receiving the prompt reply that Bethlehem of Judea was the designated place. Yet, for all his power, his gold, and his legions of heavily armed guards, herd remained utterly blind to the reality that was unfolding just a few miles down the road in a humble animal shelter. He envisioned a rival born in luxury, plotting his downfall through political intrigue, completely incapable of comprehending a majesty wrapped in swaddling cloths and sheltered by straw. The contrast between the marble halls of the palace and the rough limestone cave could not have been more absolute, highlighting the great paradox of divine intervention working through the margins of human history. As the afternoon shadows began to lengthen across the Judean hills, casting long, cool patterns of indigo and grey over the dusty paths, a quiet commotion arose near the edge of Bethlehem. The foreign travelers had arrived, their magnificent caravan halting near the municipal well, causing a stir among the local merchants and Roman centurions alike. Melchior and his companions dismounted from their mounts, their silk garments rich with the scent of frankincense and myrrh, looking entirely out of place amidst the mud and stone of the provincial village, yet moving with an unshakable composure that commanded respect. Eliam and the other shepherds, having finally made up their minds to leave the flocks in the care of the younger boys, descended the hillside just as the sun began its slow, bruised descent toward the western sea. They walked with hesitant steps, their calloused hands clutching their staffs, wondering how they, simple, unlettered keepers of sheep, could possibly approach the place revealed by the angels. Yet an invisible current guided their feet, pulling them past the crowded courtyards of the overflowing inns and toward the quiet, neglected caves at the very edge of the settlement. The stage was set in profound silence, where the wisdom of the East and the simplicity of the hills would soon converge upon the exact same threshold, uniting all of humanity in a single, breathless moment of adoration. Mary heard the faint sound of approaching footsteps on the gravel outside the stable, and she gently shifted the sleeping child in her arms, her heart swelling with a quiet, luminous peace as the long-awaited evening began to unfold. Outside the low, arched entrance of the limestone grotto, the cool night air carried the faint, earthy scent of crushed wild thyme and the distant, muffled murmur of a town pressed down by imperial decrees and weary travelers. Joseph stood near the entrance, his broad shoulders resting against the damp stone wall as he exhaled a long breath that plumed softly in the crisp air. His carpenter's hands, usually accustomed to the sharp grain of cedar and the steady weight of a plumb line, were now gently folded across his chest, aching with a profound, bone-deep exhaustion that felt almost holy in its completeness. He looked down at the dirt path where the subtle scuffle of sandals announced approaching guests, his instincts as a protector momentarily flaring before dissolving entirely into the tranquil majesty of the night. There was no room for anxiety here, not beneath the vast, velvety expanse of the Judean sky where a solitary, brilliant star burned with a steady, silvery radiance that seemed to anchor the entire firmament. He thought of the long, arduous journey from Nazareth, the endless miles of rocky terrain, the rhythmic sway of the donkey bearing Mary through the blistering heat and the biting winds of twilight, and marveled at how the heavy machinery of the Roman census, designed to project the absolute dominion of Caesar Augustus, had unknowingly served as the quiet courier of heaven. Inside the sheltered warmth of the cave, Mary sat upon a fresh pallet of golden straw, her dark hair falling softly around her shoulders as she looked down at the tiny face resting against her breast. The infant breathed with a delicate, rhythmic softness, each small sigh a quiet affirmation of leave entering the world through the humblest of doors. The rough-hewn walls of the cavern absorbed the flickering amber glow of a small clay oil lamp, casting long, dancing shadows that stretched and curved like gentle guardians across the floor. She traced the soft curve of the baby's ear, marveling at the intricate miracle of flesh and bone, and wondered how the infinite expanse of the heavens could possibly be contained within such fragile, newborn hands. The swaddling cloths, clean and smelling of sun-dried linen, wrapped him securely against the chill, yet she knew that no earthly blanket could truly insulate him from the immense destiny that awaited his footsteps. In the quiet sanctuary of her own heart, she stored every single memory, the sudden appearance of the heavenly messenger in her modest home, the long road south, the shuttered doors of the crowded inns, and now this profound, luminous sanctuary shared only with the gentle breathing of resting animals. A soft scraping sound at the threshold drew her gaze upward, and she saw the heavy shadow of her husband shift as he stepped aside to allow the first visitors to enter. They came not with the pomp of royalty or the clinking armor of soldiers, but with the halting, reverent steps of men who spent their lives beneath the open stars. Eliam, the eldest of the shepherds, led the small group, his weathered face etched with the deep lines of a life exposed to the elements, his eyes wide with a mixture of awe and nervous wonder. Behind him stood his younger companions, their rough wool cloaks damp with the midnight dew, clutching their wooden staffs as though afraid their very presence might disturb the sacred stillness of the grotto. For a long moment, neither side spoke, the only sound being the gentle snort of an ox shifting its weight in the shadowed rear of the stable. Then Eliam sank slowly to his knees, the rugged wood of his staff clattering softly against the packed earth, and bowed his head so low that his grey beard brushed the straw. We saw his star in the east, and the skies themselves told us where to find the promise, Eliam whispered, his voice trembling slightly with an emotion he could no longer contain. Mary offered a serene, welcoming smile, her eyes shining with unshed tear streams as she gently adjusted the linen cloth around the child to give the shepherds a clearer view. One by one, the rough herdsmen stepped forward, their heavy, calloused hands trembling as they laid simple offerings of gratitude upon the edge of the straw, a small handful of sweet-smelling mountain herbs, a polished smooth stone found by a brook, and a small wooden whistle carved during long nights guarding the flock. They knelt in the humble dirt, their broad shoulders unburdened of every earthly care, realizing with sudden, overwhelming clarity that the Creator of the stars had chosen to make his first resting place among the lowly and the forgotten. Miles away, far beyond the sleeping hills of Bethlehem and the jagged contours of the Judean wilderness, another journey was drawing toward its inevitable convergence. High upon a rocky plateau overlooking the deep ravines near Jerusalem, a grand and weary caravan rested beneath the cold light of the exact same celestial beacon. Melchior, the eldest of the Magi, sat upright upon a velvet cushion atop his resting dromedary, his long, silver-threaded robe shimmering faintly in the starlight. His joints ached from months of relentless travel across vast, scorching deserts and freezing mountain passes, yet his dark, piercing eyes remained fixed upon the southern horizon where the brilliant star hovered directly above the outskirts of Bethlehem. He had spent decades poring over ancient scrolls, calculating the intersections of planets and the mysterious rhythms of prophetic timelines, yet all his erudition felt suddenly weightless compared to the simple, pulsating conviction in his chest. Beside him, his younger companion stirred from their restless slumber, sensing the electric shift in the air, the silent summons that urged them to complete the final leg of their extraordinary pilgrimage. King Herod the Great, meanwhile, tossed restlessly upon his magnificent ivory-inlaid bed within the heavily fortified citadel in Jerusalem, his sleep plagued by dark, jagged dreams of rising tides and crumbling crowns. Despite the thick stone walls and the sleepless guards patrolling every corridor, an inexplicable coldness seemed to seep through the royal chambers, whispering of a power that could neither be bargained with nor conquered by the sword. He knew nothing of the humble grotto at the edge of Bethlehem, nor of the straw-strewn floor where shepherds and kings were destined to meet as equals. He knew only the paranoid fear that echoed in the hollow chambers of his own ambitious heart. Back within the quiet embrace of the stable, the boundary between heaven and earth felt as thin and translucent as a morning mist. The ox and the lamb rested quietly in the background, their gentle breathing providing a steady, rhythmic heartbeat for the entire scene. Mary looked from the kneeling shepherds to the sleeping child, feeling an immense wave of gratitude wash over her soul, knowing that the long night of human waiting had finally given way to an everlasting dawn. Outside the protective threshold of the limestone cave, the Judean night stretched toward the horizon in rolling waves of indigo and charcoal, dotted with ancient olive groves that whispered softly in the shifting midnight breeze. Joseph stepped out from the warm shelter of the grotto to stretch his weary limbs, looking up toward the celestial vault where the great star burned with a brilliant, steady luminescence that seemed to anchor the entire turning sphere of the heavens. His calloused hand still held the remnants of a wooden peg he had carved earlier that evening, a simple testament to his trade and his quiet devotion, grounding the monumental miracle of the hour in the honest labor of an ordinary man. The road winding down from Jerusalem remained dark and silent, save for the distant, rhythmic crunch of gravel under the hooves of foreign camels carrying wise travelers from the far reaches of the east, guided by that same celestial beacon toward the very edge of the sleeping village. Melchior rode at the forefront of the caravan, his eyes heavy with the dust of months of desert journeying, yet shining with an unwavering certainty that transcended the political intrigues of palaces and the hollow decrees of paranoid rulers. Every breath of the desert wind carried the scent of myrrh and frankincense across the terraced hillsides, subtly mingling with the earthy fragrance of damp soil and resting flocks, creating an atmosphere charged with quiet expectation. Back within the shadowed sanctuary of the stable, Mary gently smoothed the coarse woolen folds of the swaddling cloths around the child, her heart holding a profound stillness that asked for no further explanation from the world outside, content simply to watch the steady rise and fall of the infant's chest as the universe held its collective breath in peace. The story settles now, like dust after a long journey. Thank you for listening. If you find peace here, we would love to have you back. Tap subscribe so the next story finds you. Until then, sleep deeply and wake rested.